reincarnated in Sweet Home and his system steals monster powers. Full recap. Chapter 1, Blood, Bone, and the blue screen. The first thing Sebastian felt was the sharp, unyielding sting of cold tile against his cheek. The second was the metallic taste of his own blood. He gasped, his lungs screaming as he pulled in a ragged breath. His eyes snapped open, taking in the flickering fluorescent lights and the grimy stalls of a school bathroom. This wasn't his body. The arms pressing against the floor were entirely too thin, covered in dark bruises and fading scars. A flood of alien memories violently forced their way into his mind, threatening to split his skull open. He was Sebastian Brown. An orphan. A foreigner living a miserable existence in a high school in Korea. He had no parents, no friends, and absolutely no power. To the delinquents who ruled the school, he was nothing more than a living, breathing punching bag. Pathetic, Sebastian muttered, wiping a trail of crimson from his split lip. His voice cracked, the voice of a terrified teenager. He slowly dragged himself up, leaning heavily against a cracked porcelain sink. He looked into the shattered mirror. Staring back at him was a boy with disheveled dark hair, hollow eyes, and a bruised jaw. But before he could even begin to process the reality of his reincarnation, a strange, translucent blue text materialized in the air before him. Host soul bound. Initializing human evolution system, 10%. 50%. 100%. System online. Sebastian blinked, waving a hand through the floating text. It didn't disappear. Welcome, Sebastian. In a world where human desires twist into nightmare flesh, you alone possess the ability to devour the darkness. Defeat the aberrations. Claim their power. Evolve. Before he could decipher what the floating words meant, a wet, heavy thud echoed from the hallway outside. Then, a scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, it was a guttural, tearing sound, like vocal cords being shredded from the inside out. The bathroom door was suddenly kicked open, violently rebounding off the tiled wall. It was Kong, the ringleader of the bullies who had beaten this body to a pulp just an hour ago. But Kong wasn't looking to finish the job. The large teenager stumbled into the room, clutching his head. Torrents of thick, black blood gushed from his nose, painting the floor in dark, viscous streaks. Make it stop! Make it stop! Kong shrieked, his voice distorting into a deep, unnatural bass. Sebastian froze, his instincts screaming at him to run. The memories of this world and the terrifying lore of the monsters born from human desire clicked into place. This was the monsterization process. Kong was turning. I just wanted to crush them, all of them. Kong roared. With a sickening crunch, Kang's spine snapped backward. His school uniform tore to shreds as his muscles hyper-expanded, bulging and twisting with dark, pulsing veins. His arms elongated, ending in massive, boulder-like fists. The bully's face stretched into a grotesque, permanent sneer, his eyes rolling back to reveal nothing but bloodshot white. Alert, hostile mutant detected. Monster type, muscle brute, desire. Dominance and overwhelming strength, quest issued, survive your first encounter. Reward, assimilation of the enemies. Primary trait. The muscle brute locked its empty gaze onto Sebastian. A low, vibrating growl shook the bathroom stalls. You. The monster gargled, its jaw unhinging. Crush you. It lunged. Sebastian threw himself to the right just as a colossal fist obliterated the sink where he had been standing. Porcelain shattered into deadly shrapnel, pipes burst, and water sprayed everywhere. The sheer force of the impact sent a shockwave through the room, throwing Sebastian hard against a stall door. Pain flared in his back, but the adrenaline of his new life overrode it. He couldn't die here. Not again. Not in this pathetic body. The brute turned, slipping slightly on the wet, bloody tiles, but recovered quickly, raising both fists to smash Sebastian into a red paste. Sebastian's eyes darted around the ruined bathroom. He had no weapons, no strength, and nowhere to run. The door was blocked by the hulking mass of muscle. But his gaze caught on a massive, jagged shard of the destroyed porcelain sink, gleaming sharply on the floor near the creature's massive feet. As the brute brought its fists down, Sebastian didn't scramble away. He rolled forward, directly beneath the monster's legs. The fists slammed into the floor behind him, cracking the concrete foundation. Seizing the moment, Sebastian grabbed the heavy, razor-sharp porcelain shard. His teenage arms trembled under its weight, but desperation fueled his grip. The monster let out a confused roar, turning clumsily to find its prey. "Looking for me, you ugly bastard!" Sebastian yelled. As the brute turned, exposing the pulsing, swollen veins on the side of its thick neck, Sebastian drove the jagged porcelain shard upward with every ounce of strength he possessed. The makeshift blade pierced the monster's tough hide, sinking deep into the jugular. Black, putrid blood erupted from the wound like a geyser, showering Sebastian in foul-smelling heat. The brute let out a deafening, agonizing shriek. It thrashed wildly, one of its flailing fists clipping Sebastian's shoulder and sending him flying across the room. He hit the wall hard, the breath knocked entirely out of his lungs. He watched, vision blurring, as the monster stumbled. It clawed blindly at its own neck, pulling the shard out, which only widened the fatal wound. With a final, gurgling roar, the hulking mass of muscle collapsed onto the flooded floor, twitching once before going completely still. Sebastian lay there, gasping for air, clutching his dislocated shoulder. He had barely survived. Then, the blue screen flickered back into existence, glowing brightly in the dim, ruined room. Target defeated. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained. The passive skill, minor muscle hypertrophy. A sudden, intense heat spread from Sebastian's chest, coursing through his veins. The agonizing pain in his shoulder vanished as the joint snapped back into place on its own. He watched in shock as his thin, bruised arms visibly thickened, muscle fibers weaving and tightening beneath his skin. The weakness of the bullied teenager was burning away, replaced by raw, untamed power. He slowly stood up. He felt different. He felt dangerous. Outside the bathroom, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the hallways. More screams erupted, followed by the terrifying, monstrous roars of a school descending into pure carnage. The apocalypse had arrived in Korea. Sebastian looked down at his blood-stained hands, flexing his newly strengthened fingers. A cold, determined smile crept onto his face. Let the nightmare begin. Chapter 2, The Hallway of Nightmares. Sebastian stood in the center of the flooded bathroom, the water around his sneakers running black with the brute's blood. He clenched his fists, listening to the satisfying pop of his knuckles. The frail, battered body of the bullied orphan was gone. In its place was a physique humming with dense, coiled power. Passive skill, minor muscle hypertrophy active. Strength increased by 300%. Bone density enhanced. He didn't just feel stronger, he felt grounded. But strength alone wouldn't keep him alive in this hellscape. He needed a weapon. Sebastian knelt by the shattered sink. The brute's initial punch had exposed the heavy steel plumbing inside the wall. Gripping a thick, jagged length of the water pipe, he placed his foot against the tiles and pulled. With a loud screech of tearing metal, the pipe broke free. He swung it, testing its weight. It was heavy, lethal, and perfect. Taking a deep breath, Sebastian kicked the bathroom door open and stepped into the hallway. Nothing could have fully prepared him for the sheer scale of the massacre. The brightly lit corridors of the high school had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. Lockers were dented and torn from their hinges. Windows were shattered, the glass glittering like diamonds across the blood-slicked linoleum. "Help! Somebody, please!" The scream came from his left. Sebastian tightened his grip on the steel pipe and moved. He didn't rush in blindly, he hugged the wall, moving with a predator's caution. A few yards down the hall, a girl in a torn school uniform was crawling backward, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Sebastian recognized her from his hosts. Memories Minji, the class president. She was the one who always looked away when Kong and his goons used Sebastian as a human footstool. Looming over her was something that used to be human. It was a student, but its legs had elongated and bent backward like the hind legs of a monstrous grasshopper. The creature's torso was emaciated, its ribs tearing through its skin, but its thighs were bulging with unnatural, coiled muscle. Its mouth was locked in a permanent, wind-blown grimace. "Must be first," the creature hissed, its voice vibrating like a plucked guitar string. "Fastest. I need to be the fastest." It was a mutant born from the desperate desire to outrun the competition, a track athlete consumed by his own obsession. The sprinter coiled its horrific legs, ready to launch itself at Minji and tear her apart. Sebastian didn't shout a warning. He simply stepped out from the shadows, planted his feet, and swung the heavy steel pipe like a baseball bat. The pipe connected with the side of the sprinter's elongated skull with a sickening crack. The force of Sebastian's newly enhanced muscles sent the monster crashing into a row of lockers, denting the metal doors upon impact. Minji shrieked, covering her head as the creature fell just inches from her. She looked up, her tear-filled eyes widening in disbelief when she saw who had saved her. "Sebastian," she stammered, trembling. "How?" "Quiet," Sebastian ordered, his voice cold and devoid of the meekness she remembered. The sprinter wasn't dead. The monster's head snapped back into place with a series of gruesome crunches. It locked its empty, twitching eyes onto Sebastian. "In my way!" it gurgled. "Too slow." In the blink of an eye, the creature vanished from its spot. Sebastian's instincts flared. A blur of motion rushed at him. From the right. He barely raised the pipe in time to block. The sprinter's clawed hand slammed against the steel, the sheer kinetic force driving Sebastian sliding backward across the bloody floor. His arms vibrated from the impact, but his enhanced muscles held firm. The monster bounded off the walls, ricocheting like a deadly pinball. Thud! 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 It was moving too fast to track with normal eyes. "If I try to match its speed, I'm dead," Sebastian thought, his mind racing. "I have to let it come to me." He lowered the pipe slightly, feigning a lapse in his guard. "Slow. So slow," the monster screeched, launching itself straight at Sebastian's chest, its claws extended to rip his heart out. Sebastian didn't dodge. Instead, he dropped the pipe, raised his hands, and caught the creature's wrists in mid-air. Momentum pushed Sebastian back, his sneakers squealing against the tiles, but he dug his heels in. The sprinter gnashed its teeth, thrashing wildly, but it was trapped. "You're fast," Sebastian whispered, his eyes locking with the monster's. "But you're light." Using his 300% increased strength, Sebastian violently twisted his arms. The sound of the monster's wrists snapping echoed down the hallway. The sprinter shrieked, a sound like tearing metal. Without missing a beat, Sebastian drove his knee upward, smashing it directly into the creature's exposed ribcage. Bones caved in, piercing the monster's internal organs. As the creature went limp, Sebastian let it drop to the floor, grabbing his steel pipe and bringing it down heavily on its skull to ensure it wouldn't get back up. Target defeated. Extracting core. Ability, success. Host has gained. The active skill, kinetic dash. Allows the host to move at 200% maximum human speed for short bursts. Cooldown, 10 seconds. A rush of cold energy washed over his legs. He could feel the tendons in his calves and thighs tightening, adapting to the new skill. He had power, and now, he had speed. Sebastian looked down at Minji, who was staring at him as if he were a ghost. "Get up," he told her, his tone flat. What is happening?" she cried, hugging her knees. "What are those things?" "The end of the world," Sebastian replied, turning his gaze to the large windows at the end of the corridor. Outside, the city of Seoul was burning. Plumes of thick black smoke rose into the sky. Military helicopters buzzed in the distance, only to be swatted out of the air by monstrous appendages extending from skyscrapers. Whether here in Korea, or across the ocean in America or Europe, humanity was falling. No nation's military might was enough to stop a plague born from the depths of human desire. Suddenly, the floor beneath them vibrated. It wasn't a localized tremor, the entire school foundation was shaking. A shadow fell over the corridor, blocking out the sunlight from the windows. Sebastian slowly walked toward the glass, gripping his pipe. Minji whimpered, crawling backward. Rising from the courtyard outside, peering directly into the third-floor window, was an eye the size of a minivan. It blinked slowly, its massive pupil dilating as it focused on Sebastian. The blue screen flickered violently in front of him. Alert, Apex threat detected. Monster type, Behemoth, Desire. Unquenchable gluttony, warning, immediate evacuation advised. Survival probability, 2%. Sebastian stared back at the massive eye, a cold bead of sweat rolling down his neck. He tightened his grip on the bloody pipe, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. 2%, hey, he muttered, a reckless grin forming on his face. Guess we better start running. Chapter 3, Shattered Concrete and the Unseen Terror. The giant eye pulled back from the glass, but the momentary relief was a lie. A split second later, the entire side of the school building exploded inward. Concrete, steel rebar, and shattered glass erupted into the corridor as a massive, fleshy appendage smashed through the walls. It wasn't a hand. It was a grotesque, elongated tongue lined with jagged, shark-like teeth, searching blindly through the rubble for anything it could consume. The behemoth wasn't just hungry, it was starvation incarnate. Move! Sebastian roared. Minji was frozen, her screams trapped in her throat as the spiked tongue swept toward her, tearing up the floorboards like wet paper. Sebastian didn't think, he reacted. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. The world around him seemed to stutter. For a terrifying, exhilarating second, the chaotic explosion of debris suspended in mid-air. The muscles in Sebastian's legs burned with a sudden, intense heat, compressing like industrial springs. He pushed off the cracked tile. He crossed the distance in a blur, grabbing Minji by the collar of her uniform and hauling her backward just as the massive tongue swept through the space she had occupied a microsecond before. The sheer wind pressure of the near miss threw them both violently down the hallway. They crashed into a row of metal lockers, tangling in a heap of bruised limbs. Sebastian gasped, his lungs burning. His legs trembled violently. Moving at twice the speed of human limits placed a terrifying strain on his newly enhanced tendons. Kinetic dash on cooldown, 10 seconds. Get up! Sebastian hissed, dragging Minji to her feet. It knows we're here. The massive tongue retracted, pulling chunks of the school out into the courtyard. The behemoth let out a gargling, thunderous roar that rattled Sebastian's teeth. The ceiling groaned, raining plaster dust upon them. The structural integrity of the third floor was completely compromised. If they stayed, they would either be eaten or crushed. I can't. My ankle, Minji sobbed, leaning heavily against the dented lockers. She looked at Sebastian, her tear-streaked face pale with guilt and terror. Sebastian, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we never helped you. Please, don't leave me here. Sebastian looked at her coldly. The old Sebastian, the bullied orphan, might have felt a spark of vindication. But the new Sebastian felt nothing but the ticking clock of his own survival. Your apologies don't stop monsters, Minji, Sebastian said, his grip tightening on his bloodied steel pipe. I'm not leaving you, because a moving target might distract it. But if you fall behind, I will not carry you. Walk, or die. Your choice. He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and sprinted toward the emergency stairwell at the far end of the hall. Minji choked back a sob, but the primal fear of the monstrous roaring outside forced her crippled leg into motion. She limped frantically after him. The corridor was a nightmare. Lockers were smeared with dark blood, and the fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting long, frantic shadows. Every shadow felt like a threat. They reached the heavy fire doors of the stairwell. Sebastian pressed his back against the wall, holding up a hand to signal Minji to stop. He listened. Beneath the distant roaring of the behemoth and the crumbling of concrete, there was a new sound. It was coming from the stairs below them. Crunch. Squelch. Crack. It sounded like wet leather being torn apart. Sebastian swallowed hard. The blue screen remained silent. The system only warned him of immediate, direct threats in his line of sight. Whatever was down there, the system wasn't going to hold his hand. He nudged the fire door open just an inch. The stairwell was plunged in near total darkness, the emergency lights having failed on this side of the building. But the smell hit him instantly, coppery, raw, and suffocatingly thick. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the gloom. Halfway down the flight of stairs to the second floor, a figure was crouched over the mutilated remains of a teacher. But there was something incredibly wrong with the figure. It was entirely translucent, like a heat mirage shimmering in the dark. It was a mutant. But unlike the hulking brute or the hyperfast sprinter, this one was practically invisible. Its skin was shifting rapidly, mimicking the blood-stained concrete of the stairs perfectly. Desire to disappear, Sebastian realized. Desire to be unseen, to hide from the world. As if sensing his gaze, the crunching stopped. The translucent figure slowly turned its head toward the crack in the door. Two hollow, glowing yellow eyes manifested in the shimmering silhouette. I see you, a voice whispered. It didn't come from the creature, the voice echoed directly inside Sebastian's head, like a cold needle piercing his brain. Suddenly, the creature dissolved completely into the darkness, vanishing without a sound. Sebastian's blood ran cold. The behemoth was tearing the building apart behind them, but a literal invisible killer was waiting in the only exit ahead. Sebastian! Minji whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. Why did you stop? Don't make a sound, Sebastian breathed, gripping his pipe with white-knuckled intensity. He kicked the fire door open fully, stepping into the dark, echoing stairwell. His eyes darted wildly, searching for any ripple in the air, any out-of-place shadow. Nothing. Kinetic dash. Cool down, 0 seconds. A soft, chilling laugh echoed through the stairwell, bouncing off the walls from all directions at once. Where are you hiding? The voice hissed in his mind. Then, Sebastian felt a cold breeze brush the back of his neck. Chapter 4, the unseen blade and the blood trail, the cold breath against his neck was all the warning Sebastian got. He didn't turn around to look. Instinct and the brutal combat awareness of his enhanced body took over completely. He dropped to his knees, throwing his upper body forward just as a sharp, agonizing whistle of displaced air sliced through the space his head had occupied a fraction of a second before. Even with his quick reaction, a burning agony flared across his left shoulder blade. 4 deep, parallel lines tore through his school uniform, blood instantly soaking the fabric. Sebastian! Minji screamed from the doorway, her voice echoing shrilly in the dark stairwell. Stay back! Sebastian roared, scrambling away and swinging his heavy steel pipe in a wide arc. Behind him, the pipe cut through empty air. Nothing. No resistance, no sound of impact. He backed up against the cold concrete wall, his eyes darting frantically across the dim landing. The bleeding teacher lay butchered a few feet away, but otherwise, the space appeared completely empty. Yet, the overwhelming metallic stench of blood and the prickling of his skin told him the predator was right there in the room with them. It wants to be invisible, Sebastian thought, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It wants to hide. But it still has a physical body. I can taste your fear. The voice whispered directly into his mind, scraping against his sanity like rusted nails. A sudden, faint splash caught Sebastian's attention. He glanced down. A pool of the dead teacher's blood was expanding across the concrete. Right at the edge of the red puddle, a single, bloody footprint materialized out of thin air. Then another. The invisible creature was circling him. You talk too much for something trying to hide, Sebastian sneered, fighting through the searing pain in his back. He needed to expose it. His eyes quickly scanned the walls. Next to the heavy fire door where Minji was cowering, a red emergency fire extinguisher hung in a glass box. Another bloody footprint appeared, this one closer. The creature was winding up for a lethal strike. Warning, lethal attack imminent. Sebastian didn't hesitate. He lunged to his right, bypassing the invisible monster entirely, and swung his steel pipe with all the monstrous, 300% enhanced strength he could muster. He didn't aim for the creature. He aimed for the wall. The steel pipe smashed through the glass box and crushed the pressurized canister of the fire extinguisher. A deafening bang echoed through the stairwell as the canister ruptured. A massive, violently expanding cloud of thick, white chemical retardant exploded outward, instantly filling the enclosed landing with a blinding fog. Minji shrieked, covering her face as the white powder coated everything, including the monster. In the center of the white cloud, a horrifying silhouette was instantly painted in stark relief. It was a tall, emaciated humanoid with abnormally long arms ending in foot-long, razor-sharp bone scythes. The white powder clung to its shifting, translucent skin, completely neutralizing its camouflage. The creature let out a confused, screeching hiss, thrashing its scythe-like arms to shake the powder off. Got you, Sebastian whispered, his eyes locking onto the creature's exposed neck. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. The world around Sebastian slowed to a crawl. The falling white powder seemed to hang suspended in the air. The muscles in his legs contracted with explosive force, tearing the linoleum beneath his sneakers as he launched himself forward. Before the monster could even register his movement, Sebastian closed the distance. Moving at twice the speed of maximum human capability, he brought the heavy steel pipe down in a brutal, overhand strike. Crack! The steel pipe collided directly with the creature's skull. The sheer kinetic impact shattered the monster's head like a dropped melon, sending a spray of black blood mixing sickeningly with the white chemical dust. The long-limbed creature collapsed instantly, its bone scythes clattering against the concrete stairs as it twitched and died. Sebastian stood over the corpse, panting heavily. His muscles burned, and his back throbbed, but a triumphant heat began to spread through his chest. Target defeated. Extracting core. Ability, success. Host has gained. The active skill, Shadow Veil, allows the host to blend into the surrounding environment, bending light to become nearly invisible for 30 seconds. Cooldown, 5 minutes. Movement cancels the effect. A chilling sensation washed over his skin, like a layer of frost settling over his pores. He could feel the power settling into his nervous system. It wasn't true invisibility, but a perfect camouflage. It was exactly what he needed to survive the larger horrors roaming the streets of Korea. Sebastian. Minji coughed, waving the settling white dust away from her face. She stared at the mangled, powdery corpse on the floor, her whole body trembling. You killed it. I survived it, Sebastian corrected coldly, wiping black blood off his face. He ignored the stinging in his back. His enhanced bone density and minor muscle hypertrophy were already working to staunch the bleeding. Don't get comfortable. We need to reach the ground floor before that giant eyeball outside brings the whole building down on our heads. He grabbed Minji's arm, roughly pulling her forward. She cried out in pain as she put weight on her twisted ankle, but she bit her lip and forced herself to keep moving. The sheer ruthlessness in Sebastian's eyes terrified her almost as much as the monsters. They navigated the remaining flights of stairs in tense, suffocating silence. The sounds of destruction from above were growing louder. The behemoth was tearing through the upper floors, searching for the prey that had escaped it. Finally, they reached the heavy double doors leading to the first floor lobby. Sebastian kicked the doors open, pipe at the ready, only to freeze dead in his tracks. The lobby was a war zone. The massive glass doors leading to the courtyard were completely shattered. Overturned desks, lockers, and structural debris littered the sprawling room. But that wasn't what made Sebastian's blood run cold. Standing in the center of the lobby, blocking their only path to the street, were 3 muscle brutes. They were tearing apart the remains of the school security guards, their massive jaws snapping bone like twigs. As the stairwell door banged open, all 3 hulking monsters stopped. They slowly turned their grotesque, blood-soaked faces toward Sebastian and Minji. 3 pairs of bloodshot eyes locked onto them. Minji let out a whimper, collapsing to her knees in pure despair. Sebastian tightened his grip on his steel pipe, the metal creaking under his grip. His mind raced. 3 brutes. A crippled girl. And a behemoth tearing down the ceiling above them. He didn't step back. A cold, dangerous smile spread across his bruised face. "All right, system," Sebastian muttered, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. "Let's see what we can really do." Chapter 5, Blood in the Shadows. The 3 muscle brutes dropped the mangled remains of the security guards, the horrific sound of wet tearing echoing through the ruined lobby. Their grotesque, hyperinflated chests heaved, pumping dark blood through veins as thick as garden hoses. Under the reception desk. "Now," Sebastian ordered, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. Minji didn't argue. She scrambled on her hands and knees, dragging her injured ankle behind her until she disappeared beneath the heavy oak counter of the front desk. Sebastian stepped forward, rolling his shoulders. The pipe in his hand felt light, a mere extension of his enhanced musculature. 3-to-1 odds. A normal human would have been pounded into a red smear on the linoleum in seconds. But Sebastian wasn't normal anymore. The brute in the center roared, a sound like a revving chainsaw, and charged. Each of its footsteps cracked the floor tiles. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. The world warped. Sebastian shot forward like a bullet exiting a chamber, slipping effortlessly beneath the monster's swinging, boulder-like fist. He didn't aim for the head or the chest, those were too heavily armored with mutated muscle. He aimed for the foundation. He swung the steel pipe with every ounce of his 300% enhanced strength, slamming it directly into the side of the charging brute's left knee. A sickening crack reverberated through the lobby as the monster's leg bent completely backward. The brute let out a deafening screech, its forward momentum sending it crashing face first into a row of metal lockers. But there was no time to celebrate. The other two monsters were already on him. A shadow fell over Sebastian. He looked up just in time to see the second brute. Leaping through the air, both fists raised like executioner's hammers. Sebastian threw himself backward, rolling over the shattered glass. The monster's fists impacted the floor where Sebastian had just been standing, instantly pulverizing the concrete and sending a shockwave that threw Sebastian off balance. He crashed hard into a pile of overturned vending machines, his breath leaving him in a violent rush. The third brute flanked him, ripping a heavy metal desk out of the floor and hurling it across the room. Sebastian scrambled over the debris, narrowly avoiding the flying desk as it smashed into the wall behind him. His kinetic dash was still on its 10-second cooldown. He was outgunned, outmassed, and cornered. The two remaining brutes began to close in on the pile of rubble, their eyes glowing with blind rage. Sebastian pressed his back against the cold metal of a vending machine. He closed his eyes and breathed out. Active skill, Shadow Veil engaged. A sudden, freezing sensation cascaded over his skin. The air around him shimmered like heat off an asphalt road, and the colors of his uniform and skin rapidly shifted to match the grey concrete and dark shadows of the rubble. As long as he didn't move a single muscle, he was practically invisible. The heavy, thudding footsteps of the brutes approached. Thump! 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 Sebastian held his breath. His heart hammered so violently he feared the monsters would hear it. One of the brutes stepped right up to the vending machine. It was so close that Sebastian could smell the foul, coppery stench of its breath. Hot drool dripped from its unhinged jaw, splattering onto the floor just inches from Sebastian's foot. The monster turned its head, its bloodshot eyes scanning the rubble, looking straight through Sebastian's camouflaged form. 5 seconds, Sebastian counted in his head. 4, 3, 2, 1. Kinetic dash cooldown, 0 seconds. Sebastian's eyes snapped open. The shadow veil instantly shattered as he exploded upward. He didn't swing the pipe this time. He gripped it with both hands like a spear, triggering his kinetic dash. The sudden burst of superhuman speed drove the jagged, torn metal end of the pipe directly up through the underside of the brute's jaw. The steel pierced the monster's brain and erupted through the top of its skull in a spray of black gore. The creature stiffened, dead before it even realized it had been hit, its massive weight slumping forward. Sebastian didn't let go. Using the dead brute as a shield, he braced himself just as the final monster let out a furious roar and charged. The third brute slammed into its dead companion, driving Sebastian backward. The immense kinetic force shattered the vending machines. Behind him, Sebastian's grip on the pipe was torn away, leaving him weaponless as the enraged monster knocked the corpse aside and lunged for him. Huge, clawed hands wrapped around Sebastian's throat, lifting him completely off the floor. The brute squeezed, cutting off Sebastian's air supply. Black spots danced in his vision. The monster's jaw opened wide, preparing to bite his head clean off. Not again. Sebastian thought, his survival instincts screaming. He reached up, grabbing the brute's thick wrists. His minor muscle hypertrophy flared, fighting against the monster's crushing grip. With a guttural yell, Sebastian swung his legs up, planting both of his sneakers squarely against the monster's chest. Using his enhanced bone density and leg strength, he kicked out with everything he had. The force broke the monster's grip, sending the hulking creature stumbling backward. Sebastian hit the floor gasping for air, but he didn't stop moving. He scrambled to his feet, eyes darting wildly for a weapon. His gaze landed on the heavy metal desk the brute had thrown earlier. One of its thick, steel legs had broken off, ending in a sharp point. The monster recovered, roaring and charging like a runaway freight train. Sebastian snatched the steel desk leg off the floor. He planted his feet, lowering his center of gravity. As the brute closed the final few feet, swinging a massive fist that could cave in a brick wall, Sebastian perfectly timed his kinetic dash. He ducked under the wild swing, the wind pressure alone stinging his cheek, and drove the sharp steel leg directly into the center of the monster's hyper-expanded chest. Right where its heart should be. The brute's momentum carried it forward, impaling itself further onto the steel spike. It let out a weak, gurgling gasp, its eyes rolling into the back of its head before it collapsed heavily onto the floor, shaking. The entire lobby. Sebastian stood over the carnage, his chest heaving, his clothes soaked in dark blood. Targets defeated. Extracting core abilities, host already possesses minor muscle hypertrophy. Converting redundant skills into upgrade points, success. Passive skill minor muscle hypertrophy upgraded to intermediate muscle hypertrophy. Strength increased to 500%. A searing, explosive heat rushed through his entire body. He fell to one knee, gritting his teeth as his muscles visibly swelled and condensed, packing on terrifying layers of dense, coiled power. He felt lighter, deadlier. Suddenly, a deafening explosion ripped through the ceiling of the lobby. Concrete boulders the size of cars rained down, crushing the front desk. A monstrous, red tongue lined with razor-sharp teeth whipped through the gaping hole, searching frantically. The behemoth had finally broken through to the ground floor. Minji! Sebastian yelled, his voice slicing through the chaos. She crawled out from under the debris of the reception desk. Coughing through the thick cloud of plaster dust, her face completely pale. Sebastian rushed over, effortlessly scooping her up into his arms. With his newly upgraded strength, she felt as light as a feather. He didn't look back. He sprinted full tilt toward the shattered glass doors of the entrance, bursting out of the school and into the open air. They hit the street just as the entire facade of the high school collapsed inward, swallowed by the massive, shifting mass of the behemoth. Sebastian stopped in the middle of the road, gently setting Minji down. He looked up, taking in the apocalyptic sight before him. The sprawling city of Seoul was a burning wasteland. Cars were overturned and abandoned in the streets. Plumes of thick, black smoke choked the sky, blocking out the sun. In the distance, monstrous silhouettes the size of skyscrapers tore through commercial buildings, while the agonizing screams of millions echoed through the concrete canyons of Korea. Sebastian tightened his fists, feeling the immense power coursing through his veins. The system interface hovered in the corner of his vision, a silent promise of endless evolution. The world had ended. But for Sebastian Brown, the hunt was just beginning. Chapter 6, The Shotgun, the Immortal, and the Shop of Lights. Ash drifted down from the burning sky like grey snow. The sprawling metropolis of Seoul had been transformed into a sprawling graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass. The distant, thunderous footsteps of the behemoth faded as it lumbered toward the city center, drawn by the wailing sirens of dying police cruisers. Sebastian crouched behind a flipped taxi, dragging Minji with him. The air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and copper. "We can't stay on the main streets," Sebastian whispered, his eyes scanning the chaotic avenues. His enhanced muscles thrummed with residual adrenaline. Every monster in a 5-mile radius is going to converge on the loud noises. We need an alleyway. A choke point. Minji nodded weakly, clutching her swollen ankle. Her face was pale, smeared with dirt and dried blood. She pointed a trembling finger toward a narrow, claustrophobic gap between two towering apartment complexes. There. It cuts through to the residential district. My house is near there. Sebastian didn't care about her house, but the alley offered concealment. He hoisted her up, his 500% enhanced strength making her weight completely negligible. Keep quiet. If you scream, I'll drop you. They slipped into the shadows of the alley. The transition was jarring. The deafening roar of the apocalypse seemed to muffle the deeper they went into the narrow, twisting corridor. The sunlight was blocked by the towering brick walls, plunging them into a suffocating twilight. At the very end of the long alley, piercing through the gloom, was a warm, unnatural yellow glow. It was spilling out onto the pavement from a small, unassuming storefront. The neon sign above the door hummed quietly, bearing two words, Light Shop. Who leaves their lights on during the end of the world? Sebastian muttered, narrowing his eyes. There was something deeply unsettling about that warm glow. It felt like a beacon, suspended halfway between the realm of the living and the dead. Before they could take another step, a horrifying sound echoed from the fire escape directly above them. Click! 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 It sounded like a massive insect chattering its mandibles. Sebastian froze, instantly pressing Minji against the damp brick wall. He tightened his grip on the bloodied steel desk leg. Something dropped from the third-story fire escape, landing on top of a dumpster with a heavy, wet thud. It was a mutant, but its appearance was stomach-turning. The creature was a towering, emaciated humanoid. But the top half of its head had been cleanly sliced off, exposing a pulsing, grotesque mass of brain tissue and twitching sensory tendrils. It had no eyes. It had no nose. But the exposed brain throbbed with a sickening rhythm. Alert, hostile mutant detected. Monster type, the blind sight, desire, unseen observation, warning, extremely sensitive to sound. It's blind, Sebastian breathed, his voice barely a vibration in the air. Do not move a muscle. Minji covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. But as she pressed herself harder against the wall to hide, her injured foot dragged across a loose piece of gravel. Scrunch! The blind monster's exposed brain flared violently. It let out a blood-curdling, high-pitched screech and whipped its head directly toward them. Damn it! Sebastian roared. The creature leaped off the dumpster, its arms elongating into sharp, fleshy spears. Sebastian planted his feet, preparing to trigger his kinetic dash and meet the monster head on. But before his muscles could compress, the deafening roar of gunfire shattered the silence of the alley. Boom! A massive spray of buckshot tore through the air, ripping a massive chunk of flesh out of the blind monster's shoulder. The creature shrieked in agony, its trajectory completely thrown off as it crashed into a pile of garbage cans. Sebastian snapped his head up. Standing on the second-story fire escape, enveloped in a cloud of gunsmoke, was a high school boy. He looked terrified, his uniform torn and his knees shaking visibly, but his grip on the heavy, black shotgun was resolute. It was Han Jiawan. Hey! Jiawan shouted, his voice cracking as he pumped the shotgun, ejecting a smoking red shell. Get away from them, you freak! The blind monster ignored Sebastian entirely. Infuriated by the gunshot, it coiled its legs, preparing to launch itself up to the fire escape to rip the boy to shreds. Kid, move! Sebastian yelled. But a sudden, heavy footstep echoed from the other end of the alley, near the glowing light shop. A man stepped out of the shadows. He wore a dusty, battered suit, his tie loosened around his thick neck. He had broad shoulders, a rugged face, and the exhausted demeanor of a man who had worked a 24-hour shift. Do you brats have to make so much noise? Zhang Juwan grumbled, rolling his thick neck. The blind monster, sensing the new, heavier vibration, spun around. With blinding speed, the creature lunged at Juwan, extending its fleshy spear arm and driving it with terrifying force straight into the man's stomach. The fleshy spike erupted out of Juwan's back, dripping with fresh blood. Minji screamed. Jiawan froze on the fire escape, his eyes wide with horror. Sebastian gritted his teeth, ready to intervene, but then he noticed something. Impossible. The blue system screen hadn't reacted. And Juwan hadn't even flinched. I said, Juwan growled, his face twisting into a terrifying scowl as he looked down at the appendage impaling his torso. Keep it down. Juwan grabbed the monster's fleshy spear with two massive, calloused hands. With a violent, brutal twist, he snapped the limb clean in half. The monster shrieked, stumbling backward. Juwan casually pulled the remaining chunk of meat out of his own stomach and tossed it aside. To Sebastian's absolute shock, the gaping, fatal wound in the man's abdomen instantly began to knit together. Muscle fibers reconnected, skin stitched itself shut, and a faint wisp of steam rose from his body. Within seconds, it was as if he had never been stabbed at all. He's not a monster, Sebastian realized, his mind racing. But he's not normal. Who the hell are these people? Juwan didn't give the creature time to recover. He closed the distance like a heavyweight boxer, throwing a punch that carried the weight of a freight train. His fist connected with the monster's ribcage, shattering it with a sound like a bomb going off. The creature staggered, disoriented. That was all the opening Sebastian needed. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. Sebastian exploded forward, a blur of motion. Moving at 200% speed, he bypassed Juwan entirely, utilizing his 500% enhanced strength. He drove the sharp steel desk leg directly upward, plunging it through the bottom of the monster's jaw and straight up into its exposed, writhing brain. The creature stiffened, convulsed once, and went completely limp. Sebastian ruthlessly kicked the corpse off his makeshift spear, panting lightly. Target defeated. Extracting core. Ability, success. Host has gained. The passive skill, echolocation, allows the host to map their physical surroundings up to 50 meters through sound wave vibration. A sharp, ringing sensation echoed in Sebastian's ears before settling into a strange, hyper-aware clarity. He could suddenly hear the steady, racing heartbeat of Jiawan on the fire escape, the ragged breathing of Minji behind him, and the impossibly calm, rhythmic pulse of Juwan standing a few feet away. Juwan brushed some dust off his ruined suit jacket and looked at Sebastian, his dark eyes analyzing the teenager's blood-soaked clothes and the brutal efficiency of his kill. You hit hard for a kid, Juwan noted gruffly. Up on the fire escape, Jiawan slowly lowered his shotgun, his hands still trembling. Is it dead? It's dead, Sebastian confirmed coldly, wiping black blood off his cheek. He looked at the shotgun boy, then at the immortal man in the suit. The world was ending, but clearly, the monsters weren't the only anomalies walking the streets of Korea. Before anyone else could speak, a soft chime rang through the alley. The wooden door of the light shop slowly creaked open. A tall, enigmatic man with a calm, unreadable face stood in the doorway. The warm yellow light spilled out around him, offering a terrifyingly peaceful contrast to the bloody slaughterhouse of the alleyway. It's dangerous to linger in the dark, the shop owner said, his voice smooth and hauntingly gentle. Why don't you all come inside? Chapter 7, The Liminal Sanctuary. The warm, yellow glow spilling from the light shop felt profoundly wrong. In a city drowning in blood and fire, this small, immaculate storefront was an anomaly that set Sebastian's newly enhanced instincts on edge. Zhang Juwan, the man with the impossibly regenerating flesh, didn't hesitate. He trudged past the enigmatic shop owner, his heavy footfalls thudding against the wooden floorboards. Jiawan, the terrified teenager with the shotgun, practically scrambled down the fire escape and rushed inside, desperate for any semblance of safety. Sebastian lingered on the threshold, his grip tight on his blood-soaked steel desk leg. He pulled Minji inside, but his eyes remained fixed on the shop owner. "Close the door," the owner said softly, his voice devoid of any panic. "The shadows are growing restless." Sebastian kicked the door shut. The instant the latch clicked, the apocalyptic cacophony of the burning city of Seoul was perfectly, impossibly silenced. The interior of the shop was lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, each displaying hundreds of incandescent light bulbs. They varied in shape, size, and brightness, casting a surreal, dreamlike illumination across the room. The air smelled of old dust and ozone. Sebastian narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't right. Passive skill, echolocation active. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the ambient sound waves paint a picture of the room in his mind. What he heard nearly made him drop his weapon. The light bulbs weren't just humming with electricity. They were pulsing. Thump thump. Thump thump. A faint, rhythmic heartbeat emanated from every single glass bulb in the shop. They weren't just lights, they were vessels. Life forces suspended in glass, trapped between the world of the living and whatever came next. Sebastian's gaze snapped to the owner, who was simply polishing a pristine glass bulb with a microfiber cloth. The man offered a faint, knowing smile. "Take a seat," the owner gestured to a small wooden bench. "You look tired." "Who are you?" Sebastian demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Just a man who sells lights," the owner replied smoothly. "To those who are struggling to find their way in the dark." Ji-won grunted, collapsing onto a nearby stool. The horrific, gaping wound in his stomach had completely vanished, leaving only a jagged hole in his dusty suit and a dark stain on his undershirt. "Doesn't matter who he is, kid. The monsters aren't coming in here. I can feel it. This place. It's practically invisible to them." Jiawan collapsed into the corner, hugging his shotgun to his chest, his whole body shaking violently. "It's all gone," he whispered, his eyes wide and vacant. "Everything is gone. The school, the streets. The whole world," Ji-won rumbled, pulling a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He didn't light one, just held it between his lips. "Before the military radio went dead, I heard the emergency broadcasts. It isn't just Korea. The infection is global. They said Tokyo was completely overrun in a matter of hours. The massive military bases in America were wiped off the map by their own soldiers turning into those freaks. There is no country left to save us. Guns, tanks, missiles. None of it matters when the person sitting next to you suddenly turns into a carnivorous monster because they wanted a promotion too badly." Sebastian leaned against the wall, processing the information. The system had warned him this was a global apocalypse, but hearing the sheer scale of the collapse confirmed his ultimate truth: the only law left was power. Current host status: strength, 500%, intermediate muscle hypertrophy, speed, 200%, kinetic dash, cooldown, tens, stealth, shadow veil, cooldown, 5m. Perception, echolocation, range, 50m, strong, but if a behemoth cornered him right now, he stay here, Sebastian stated coldly, looking at Ji-won. He would be crushed into paste. He needed to hunt. He needed to evolve. "We can't." And Ji-won. Minji, who was huddled on the floor desperately wrapping her swollen ankle with torn fabric from her uniform, looked up in horror. "Are you insane? We finally found a safe place. You heard him, the monsters can't see this shop. They can't see the shop, Sebastian corrected, his eyes flashing to the owner. But they can smell the blood on us. They can hear our breathing. This place is a sanctuary for the dying, not a fortress for the living. As if responding to his words, the hundreds of light bulbs in the shop suddenly flickered. The warm yellow light dimmed to a sickly, pale gray. The shop owner stopped polishing his bulb. His serene expression finally cracked, replaced by a grim line of concern. He is right, the owner whispered. Something very old, and very hungry, has picked up your scent. Thump. A massive tremor shook the ground, rattling the wooden shelves. Several glass bulbs clattered against each other, their inner heartbeats spiking in a frantic, terrified rhythm. Thump. It was coming from the alleyway. The vibrations were heavy, deliberate, and entirely predatory. Through his active echolocation, Sebastian saw the outline of the creature outside through the walls. It was low to the ground, built like a massive, overgrown wolf, but its body was composed entirely of shifting, jagged bone plating. A thick, whip-like tail ended in a heavy, spiked club. Alert, high threat mutant detected. Monster type, the Bonehound, desire, unbreakable defense and slaughter, shotgun kid, Sebastian barked, snapping Jiawan out of his catatonic daze. Get off the floor. Check your ammo. What? Jiawan stammered, scrambling to his feet and instinctively checking the breech of his weapon. I only have 4 shells left. Make them count. Sebastian turned to Jiawan, who was already cracking his thick knuckles, his tired eyes turning lethal. You heal fast, old man. Think you can take a hit from a monster made of solid bone? I've survived worse, Jiawan growled, cracking his neck from side to side. The massive shadow of the Bonehound fell over the frosted glass of the light shop's front window. A low, vibrating growl echoed through the glass, a sound that bypassed the ears and rattled directly in their bones. The creature didn't try to open the door. With a deafening crash, the front window shattered inward. A massive, bone-plated skull violently forced its way into the sanctuary, its jaws opening to reveal rows of serrated, metallic teeth. Light 'em up! Sebastian roared. Jiawan squeezed the trigger. The deafening roar of the shotgun blew away the remaining silence of the shop, lighting up the dim room with a brilliant, lethal flash. Chapter 8, The Convergence of Nightmares. The deafening blast of the shotgun in the enclosed space of the light shop was enough to rupture eardrums. A violently bright muzzle flash illuminated the room in stark white, and a spray of heavy buckshot slammed directly into the Bonehound's face. But the monster didn't fall. The lead pellets ricocheted off its thick, ivory-white bone plating with a series of sharp pings, doing nothing more than infuriating the beast. The Bonehound let out a roar that shook the shelves, its jaw snapping wildly as it forced its massive shoulders through the shattered window frame. It didn't work. Jiawan screamed, stumbling backward over a wooden stool and falling to the floor. He fumbled frantically with his pockets, his trembling hands struggling to load another red shell into the chamber. Move, kid! Jiawan bellowed. The immortal man didn't run away. He charged forward, throwing his massive, broad-shouldered frame directly at the beast. The Bonehound lunged, its jagged, metallic teeth sinking deep into Jiawan's shoulder, tearing through his suit jacket and crushing the flesh beneath. The sickening sound of bones grinding echoed through the shop. Jiawan didn't even scream. His face contorted into a mask of pure, untamed rage. He wrapped his thick arms around the monster's neck in a brutal headlock, using his sheer mass to hold the thrashing creature in place. Black blood and human blood mixed on the floorboards as Jiawan's shoulder rapidly healed, only to be crushed again in the monster's jaws in a terrifying cycle of destruction and regeneration. "Do it now!" Ju-won grunted, his boots sliding against the bloody floor as the monster tried to shake him off. Sebastian didn't need to be told twice. He was already moving. His eyes locked onto the bonehound. The creature was practically a walking tank, heavily armored on top and along its flanks. But as it thrashed its head, trying to rip Ju-won apart, the softer, unarmored flesh of its underbelly and throat was exposed. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. The air warped around Sebastian as his muscles compressed and fired. He crossed the room in a fraction of a second, sliding on his knees across the floorboards directly beneath the hulking beast. He gripped the heavy, jagged steel desk leg with both hands, channeling every ounce of his 500% enhanced strength. As the monster reared its head to snap at Ju-won again, Sebastian drove the steel spike directly upward, plunging it deep into the soft, unprotected flesh just behind the creature's lower jaw. The steel tore through muscle, sinew, and brain matter, erupting out the top of the monster's skull. The bonehound went completely rigid. Its red, glowing eyes flickered and died. With a heavy, wet thud, the massive creature collapsed onto the floor, crushing the shattered glass beneath its weight. Target defeated. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained the passive skill, skeletal fortification. Bone density increased by an additional 200%. Microfractures instantly heal, heavily reinforcing the skeletal structure against kinetic impact. A deep, aching heat radiated deep within Sebastian's marrow. He felt his bones calcify, growing thicker and vastly more resilient. The sharp sting of the wounds on his back, left by the invisible mutant earlier, finally faded into a dull itch as his body adapted. He was becoming less human by the minute, and he welcomed it. He stood up, ripping his steel weapon from the monster's skull. Black blood dripped onto the floor, hissing slightly. Ju-won roughly shoved the dead monster's head off his shoulder. He rolled his arm. The agonizing bite mark was completely gone, leaving only a torn bloody sleeve. Ju-won sighed heavily, pulling a lighter from his pocket and finally lighting the cigarette dangling from his lips. "You heal," Sebastian stated, his voice flat, his echolocation picking up the impossibly steady rhythm of Ju-won's heart. "But you aren't turning. Your eyes are normal. You don't have the hunger." "I've been like this since I was a kid," Ju-won exhaled a cloud of grey smoke, his eyes tired. "The government, the NIS, thought guys like me would make good weapons. Used us for their dirty work. Turns out, there were a lot of us hiding in plain sight. People who could fly, people who could heal, people with enhanced senses." Ju-won gestured to the dead monster with his cigarette. "But this is new. These things aren't mutants from a lab. They're born from regular people. The desire inside their heads just twists them." Ji-won finally managed to load his shotgun. He sat against the wall, his chest heaving. "It's the nosebleeds," the teenager said, his voice hollow. "First, they get a terrible nosebleed. Then they start hallucinating. They hear a voice offering them exactly what they want most in the world. If they give in, they turn into those freaks." Sebastian took a step back, processing the horrifying reality of the world he had been thrown into. When he inherited the host's memories, he thought this was a simple monster apocalypse. But it was vastly more complicated, and infinitely more dangerous. This wasn't just a world of desire-driven monsters. There were superhumans walking the earth, government conspiracies, and he looked over at the shop owner, who was silently sweeping up the shattered glass as if a deadly battle hadn't just occurred, forces beyond mortal comprehension. "What is this place?" Sebastian asked, locking eyes with the owner. "A waiting room," the owner replied softly, not looking up from his broom. For those who are lost between life and death. The light guides the souls who aren't ready to let go. But the boundary is tearing. The sheer amount of death happening out there. He gestured vaguely toward the ruined city. Is causing the worlds to bleed together. The monsters are attracted to the souls. Sebastian's mind raced. An apocalypse born from human desire. Superhumans bred for war. And an afterlife that was violently spilling into the physical world. It was a chaotic blender of nightmares. There are no safe zones, are there? Sebastian muttered. Ju-1 shook his head. Radio chatter before the grid went down was grim. I heard the border outposts completely collapsed. China went dark hours ago. Russia's military mobilized, but you can't shoot a disease that lives in your own soldiers' minds. No country, no matter how vast their armies or how deep their bunkers, can stop this. We are completely on our own. The shop owner suddenly stopped sweeping. He looked up, his serene face tightening into a grim mask. All at once, the hundreds of light bulbs lining the shelves began to flicker violently. The warm, yellow light started to turn a sickly, bruised purple. Thump thump. Thump thump. The heartbeats emanating from the bulbs accelerated into a frantic, panicked rhythm. The light is dying, the shop owner whispered, stepping back from the shattered storefront. He looked at Sebastian, his eyes completely serious. This space can no longer hide you. Whatever is out there has broken the veil. You need to leave. Now. Through his echolocation, Sebastian felt a vibration so massive it nearly short-circuited his brain. It wasn't the behemoth. This was something deeper, something burrowing rapidly through the earth beneath the city streets, heading directly for the light. Shop. Up the stairs. Sebastian roared, grabbing Minji by the arm and hauling her toward the back of the shop. We go to the roof. As they sprinted for the narrow wooden staircase in the back, the floorboards of the shop began to splinter and bulge upward. A guttural, echoing screech that sounded like grinding tectonic plates erupted from the earth below. The true nightmare hadn't even begun. Chapter 9, The Subterranean Maw. The floorboards of the light shop didn't just break, they erupted. A geyser of pulverized dirt, splintered wood, and shattered glass exploded upward, violently hurling the ancient wooden shelves in every direction. The hundreds of pulsing light bulbs smashed against the walls, their trapped souls letting out a collective, ethereal wail that sent a shiver down Sebastian's heavily reinforced spine. Keep moving! Sebastian roared, practically dragging Minji up the narrow, creaking staircase. Through the suffocating cloud of dust and debris, the nightmare finally revealed itself. Bursting from the cratered floor was a creature that defied all anatomical logic. It was a massive, segmented worm, as thick as a subway car. But instead of scales, its body was armored with human faces, their mouths stretched open in silent screams of agony. And in place of legs, hundreds of elongated, multi-jointed human arms clawed frantically at the dirt, propelling the monstrosity forward. At the very front of the creature was a gaping, circular maw lined with concentric rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. Alert, Alpha-class mutant detected. Monster type, the burrower, desire, to devour and bury the world in darkness. Warning, structural integrity of the current location is critically compromised. Shoot it! Ju-1 bellowed from the base of the stairs. Jia-1, leaning over the wooden railing, pumped his shotgun and fired. The buckshot slammed into the burrower's armored hide of faces, but the lead pellets barely made a dent. The creature let out a deafening, echoing screech, a sound like grinding metal and crying children, and lunged toward the stairs, its hundreds of human arms tearing the walls apart as it climbed. It's too heavily armored! Jia-1 cried, staggering backward as the lower half of the staircase completely disintegrated beneath the monster's jaws. Ju-1 didn't retreat. The immortal man planted his feet at the edge of the collapsing floor, grabbing a massive, jagged beam of splintered support wood. With a primal roar, Ju-1 swung the beam like a baseball bat, smashing it directly into the creature's massive, tooth-filled snout. The impact cracked the beast's outer plating, but the sheer momentum of the burrower sent Ju-1 flying backward. He crashed through the wall of the stairwell, disappearing into the darkness of the collapsing shop below. "Mr. Ju-1!" Ji-1 screamed. "Don't look back, kid!" Sebastian ordered, shoving the terrified teenager up the remaining steps. "He can survive anything. We can't." The building groaned violently. The burrower was thrashing below them, its massive bulk ripping through the foundational pillars of the light shop. The walls buckled inward. Sebastian threw his shoulder against the heavy metal door at the top of the stairs, bursting out onto the flat, tar-papered roof of the building. The oppressive heat of the burning city instantly washed over them. The sky above Seoul was a suffocating canvas of crimson and black. Billowing clouds of ash drifted through the air, coating the surrounding rooftops in a thick, grey snow. Min-ji collapsed onto the tar, weeping uncontrollably as she clutched her twisted ankle. Ji-1 stumbled out behind them, his face smeared with soot, his chest heaving as he gripped his nearly empty shotgun. "Where do we go?" Ji-1 gasped, spinning in circles. Every street below them was swarming with horrors. "There's nowhere left." Before the comms died, Sebastian panted, his mind calculating a million desperate scenarios at once. Ju-1 said he heard military chatter. What was it? Ji-1 swallowed hard, his eyes wide with panic. I heard him talking to the other agents before our camp was overrun. They said there were heavily armed civilian ferries attempting to cross the sea to Japan. They were mobilizing from the eastern ports. Sebastian looked toward the east, where the skyline was obscured by smoke. Japan. It was a name, a destination, but it wasn't a beacon of hope. "Don't fool yourself," Sebastian said coldly, checking his grip on the bloody steel desk leg. "Japan is just another island. If this infection is born from human minds, their streets are drowning in just as much blood as ours. No nation's military, no matter how disciplined or advanced, can shoot a disease that turns their own citizens into apex predators from the inside out. We don't go there for salvation. We go there because moving targets are harder to kill." Before Ji-1 could process the grim reality, the center of the roof suddenly bowed violently upward. Crack! Ryeb! The tar paper tore like wet tissue. The concrete roof shattered outward, and the colossal, horrifying head of the burrower erupted into the night sky, towering 3 stories above them. Its hundreds of human arms flailed wildly in the open air, and its circular maw snapped with bone-crushing force. The building lurched, tilting dangerously to the left. "Hold on to something!" Sebastian yelled. The monster didn't aim for Ji-1 or Min-ji. Its blind, sensory tendrils locked onto the most potent source of kinetic energy on the roof, Sebastian. With a terrifying screech, the burrower lunged, its massive mouth descending to swallow him whole. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. Sebastian didn't dodge away. He couldn't. The roof was too small, and the creature's mouth was too wide. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He dashed forward, straight into the descending maw of the beast. "Sebastian!" Min-ji shrieked. The world went dark as the massive jaws clamped shut around him. The stench of decaying flesh and wet earth was suffocating. Rows of jagged, yellow teeth clamped down on him from all sides, seeking to crush his body into a bloody pulp. But Sebastian was no longer a fragile human. Passive skill, skeletal fortification active. The monster's teeth ground against Sebastian's body. His skin tore, and his uniform was shredded, but as the immense pressure hit his bones, they held firm. His 200% denser, hypercalcified skeleton absorbed the crushing weight. It hurt a deep, agonizing pressure that felt like being trapped in an industrial vice, but he wasn't broken. Trapped in the pitch-black, suffocating throat of the monster, Sebastian used his echolocation. Thump thump. Thump thump. Through the layers of thick, armored flesh and writhing muscle, he located the creature's core, a rapidly beating, massive heart situated just behind its esophageal tract. "My turn," Sebastian snarled, blood dripping from his nose. Channeling his 500% enhanced strength, he gripped his steel desk leg with both hands. He couldn't swing it, but he could thrust it. With a guttural roar, he drove the jagged steel spike directly upward, piercing the soft, internal lining of the beast's throat, digging deep into the flesh until the metal struck the pulsating core. Outside, the burrower let out an earth-shattering, agonizing wail. The massive creature violently convulsed, rearing its head back toward the sky. Its hundreds of arms thrashed wildly, ripping chunks of concrete off the surrounding buildings. Deep inside its throat, Sebastian twisted the steel spike violently, utterly destroying the monster's heart. The beast's agonizing scream turned into a wet, gurgling rattle. Its colossal body suddenly went limp, the dead weight crashing back down onto the ruined roof. The impact split the monster's jaw open. Sebastian crawled out from the bloody, foul-smelling maw, soaked head to toe in black, viscous fluid. He collapsed onto his knees on the tilted roof, coughing violently as he dragged fresh air into his burning lungs. Target defeated. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained the active skill, seismic tremor. By striking a solid surface, the host can send a concentrated, localized shockwave through the ground to destabilize enemies. Cooldown, 30 seconds. A heavy, vibrating energy settled into Sebastian's fists. He clenched his hands, feeling the earth-shattering potential locked inside his newly fortified bones. He had survived the abyss. "You!" Jiawan whispered, staring at the blood-drenched teenager in absolute awe and terror. "You killed it from the inside." But the victory was short-lived. The burrower's massive corpse was too heavy for the compromised structure. With a sickening groan, the foundational pillars of the building finally gave way. The entire structure began to violently tilt forward, sliding toward the alleyway below. "The building is going down!" Sebastian yelled, scrambling to his feet and grabbing Minji by her collar. He pointed to the adjacent apartment complex, separated by a terrifying, 10-foot gap. "Jump! Now!" Chapter 10, The Leap and the Puppeteer's Strings. The concrete beneath their feet groaned, a sickening sound of structural death. The entire building leaned precipitously to the left, the 10-foot gap between the light shop's roof and the adjacent apartment complex widening by the second as the foundation crumbled. "I can't!" Minji shrieked, staring down into the terrifying, debris-filled abyss between the two buildings. The alleyway below was obscured by a suffocating cloud of dust and the colossal, ruined bulk of the burrower. "My ankle, I won't make it." "I didn't ask if you could make it," Sebastian snarled, stepping into her personal space. Before she could process his words, Sebastian grabbed her roughly by the thick fabric of her torn school uniform jacket and the belt of her skirt. His muscles, packed with 500% more dense kinetic power than a normal human, coiled tightly. He didn't just throw her, he launched her. Minji's scream was torn from her lungs as she sailed completely over the terrifying drop, landing hard on the flat, tar-papered roof of the opposite apartment building. She skidded a few feet, crying out as she scraped her elbows, but she was entirely safe. "Your turn, shotgun," Sebastian barked, turning to Jiawan. The building lurched violently again. A massive crack split the roof directly between them. Jiawan didn't hesitate. Driven by pure, unadulterated terror, the teenager backed up 3 steps, pumped his legs, and sprinted for the edge. He leaped, arms outstretched, his shotgun strapped tightly over his shoulder. He didn't have Sebastian's enhanced physics. Jiawan's chest slammed heavily into the concrete ledge of the apartment building. His hands scrambled frantically against the rough edge, his legs dangling over a 5-story drop into the ruins below. "Help!" Jiawan choked out, his grip slipping. Sebastian didn't panic. The roof beneath his feet was essentially in free fall now. He triggered his kinetic dash. The world slowed as he launched himself off the disintegrating ledge, crossing the chasm in a blur. He landed on the edge of the apartment roof, his massively fortified skeleton absorbing the impact without a single tremor. He reached down, grabbing Jiawan by the collar, and effortlessly hauled the teenager up onto the solid roof just as the light shop completely collapsed. With a deafening, catastrophic roar, the building imploded. Plumes of thick, choking grey dust erupted into the burning night sky, swallowing the massive corpse of the burrower and burying the sanctuary forever. Sebastian stood near the edge, his echolocation immediately scanning the massive pile of rubble below. Thump thump. Thump thump. Deep beneath the shattered concrete and splintered wood, a slow, impossibly steady heartbeat pulsed. A moment later, a massive chunk of concrete shifted, then flipped over completely. Zhang Juwan stood up amidst the ruins, coughing up a mouthful of grey dust. His suit was entirely shredded, exposing pale, heavily scarred skin that was rapidly knitting a massive puncture wound on his chest closed. The immortal man looked up at the roof, squinting through the ash. He raised a single, bloodied hand, pointing a thick finger toward the street-level entrance of the apartment building they were currently standing on. "Meet me downstairs," the gesture clearly said. Sebastian nodded curtly. He turned away from the ledge, his eyes locking onto the heavy, reinforced steel door that led into the apartment complex's stairwell. "We're moving," Sebastian ordered, looking at Minji, who was weeping quietly as she cradled her swollen ankle, and Jiawan, who was practically kissing the solid ground. "Juwan is alive. He's meeting us at the bottom. But we have to get through this building first." Jiawan swallowed hard, unholstering his shotgun with trembling hands. "It's dark in there. The power grid for the whole city is dead. What if it's full of them? Then we clear it," Sebastian said simply. He walked over to the reinforced roof access door. It was locked from the inside. Without breaking his stride, he raised his foot and delivered a devastating front kick directly to the locking mechanism. The heavy steel door buckled inward, the lock completely shattering under the sheer, hypercalcified force of his blow. The door groaned loudly as it swung open, revealing a pitch-black, suffocatingly quiet stairwell. The smell hit them instantly. It was the sickeningly sweet, metallic stench of decaying blood, layered over the stale smell of unwashed laundry. "Stay behind me. Keep your finger off the trigger until I say so," Sebastian instructed Jiawan. He didn't want the terrified kid blowing a hole in his back. Sebastian stepped into the darkness. Passive skill, echolocation active. He closed his eyes for a split second, letting the micro-vibrations of his own footsteps paint the environment in his mind. The stairwell wound downward for 5 floors. It seemed clear, but the silence was unnatural. It felt heavy, expectant. They descended the first flight of stairs in tense, agonizing silence. Minji leaned heavily on Jiawan's shoulder, stifling her cries of pain as she hobbled down the steps. As they reached the landing of the 4th floor, Sebastian held up a fist. Jiawan froze, instantly raising the barrel of his shotgun. Through his echolocation, Sebastian detected movement in the 4th floor hallway just beyond the fire door. It wasn't the heavy, predatory thud of a muscle brute, nor the frantic scurrying of a sprinter. It was a strange, disjointed scraping sound. Like wet bags of meat being dragged across linoleum. Scrape, scuff, crack. Something's in the hall. Sebastian whispered, gripping his bloody steel desk leg. Open the door. Slow. Jiawan reached out, his hand shaking violently, and pushed the handle of the fire door. It clicked open, revealing the long, pitch-black corridor of the fourth floor. Only the faint, ambient red glow of a distant emergency exit sign provided any light. Standing in the center of the hallway were three figures. They were residents. A man in a business suit, a woman in a floral dress, and a teenager. But they weren't breathing. Their heads lolled backward at grotesque, unnatural angles, their eyes glazed over and milky white. Their limbs twitched and jerked in synchronized, impossible movements. They're dead, Jiawan breathed, his voice cracking. But they're moving. Suddenly, the three corpses snapped their heads forward, locking their dead, empty eyes directly onto Sebastian. From the shadows of the ceiling above them, a horrifying truth revealed itself. Thin, pulsing, translucent tendrils descended from the dark plaster, stabbing directly into the spines and skulls of the dead bodies. The corpses weren't moving on their own. They were being operated. At the far end of the hall, suspended near the ceiling in a web of fleshy strings, was the puppet master. It was a massive, spider-like mutant, its central body composed of a bloated, fused mass of human torsos. Its face was a twisted mask of desperate, crying eyes. Alert, hostile mutant detected. Monster type, the marionette, desire, to never be alone/total control. The marionette let out a high-pitched, weeping sound that echoed terribly down the corridor. Its fleshy tendrils tightened. The three corpses raised their heads and let out simultaneous, agonizing shrieks. They lunged forward, charging down the hallway with terrifying, unnatural speed, their limbs snapping and breaking as they were forcefully puppeted toward the intruders. Shoot the one on the left! Sebastian roared. Jiawan didn't hesitate this time. The shotgun roared, a massive flash lighting up the corridor. The buckshot tore a massive hole through the chest of the suited corpse. The body was violently thrown backward, completely destroyed. But the translucent string attached to its spine didn't snap. The marionette simply yanked the string, and the mangled, chestless corpse violently righted itself, continuing its charge alongside the others. Bullets don't stop dead meat! Sebastian yelled, his mind racing. They were trapped in a choke point. If he used his kinetic dash in this narrow hallway, he risked impaling himself on the flailing limbs of the puppets. He needed to break the strings. He needed to break the foundation. Sebastian dropped to one knee, holstering his steel spike in his belt. He pulled his right arm back, channeling every ounce of his massive, upgraded kinetic power into his fist. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. Brace yourselves! Sebastian yelled. He drove his fist downward, punching the solid concrete floor of the hallway with the force of a falling meteor. Boom! A localized, devastating shockwave erupted from his fist. The concrete floor of the corridor instantly fractured, sending a violent ripple of kinetic energy tearing down the hallway. The walls buckled, plaster exploded, and the ground violently heaved. The shockwave completely shattered the footing of the charging corpses. Their legs snapped under the sudden, massive vibration, and they collapsed into a tangled heap of broken bones and flesh. The kinetic force traveled straight up the walls, violently shaking the ceiling where the marionette was anchored. The monster shrieked in panic as the ceiling began to crumble, its anchor points tearing loose. Now, Sebastian whispered, a cold, predatory light flashing in his eyes. Active skill, Shadow Veil engaged. Before the dust from the shockwave could even settle, Sebastian's form shimmered and faded into perfect invisibility. He was a ghost in the ruins. And it was time to cut the strings. Chapter 11, Severed Strings and the Bleeding Worlds. The corridor was choked with pulverized plaster and choking grey dust. The localized shockwave from Sebastian's seismic tremor had devastated the structural integrity of the fourth-floor hallway, leaving the puppet corpses crippled on the floor, their shattered legs unable to support their dead weight. But the marionette wasn't dead. Anchored to the crumbling ceiling, the bloated, multi-torsoed abomination shrieked in absolute panic. Its weeping eyes darted wildly through the dust cloud, desperately searching for the boy who had just shattered the floor. It saw nothing. The corridor appeared entirely empty. Active skill, Shadow Veil engaged. Remaining time, 24 seconds. Sebastian stood perfectly still, flattened against the cracked wall just a few feet away from the flailing puppet corpses. The camouflage rendered him completely invisible, his skin and shredded clothes perfectly mimicking the ruined, dust-covered plaster behind him. He regulated his breathing, his highly oxygenated blood pumping silently through his fortified veins. Where did you go?" The marionette sobbed, its voice a horrific chorus of overlapping, distorted human voices. Its translucent, fleshy tendrils whipped blindly through the air, smashing into the walls and floor in a desperate attempt to find its prey. One of the thick, pulsing strings slashed through the empty space mere inches from Sebastian's nose. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He waited. He needed the perfect angle. The marionette, frantic and terrified of the unseen threat, began to pull itself along the ceiling toward the stairwell, intent on slaughtering Jiawan and Minji to satiate its fear. Mistake, Sebastian thought. As the monster shifted its massive, bloated bulk, it exposed the central cluster of thick, nerve-like cords anchoring it to the ceiling. Kinetic dash cooldown, 0 seconds. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. The moment he engaged his muscles, the shadow veil instantly shattered, revealing his blood-soaked, heavily muscled frame in the dim red light of the emergency exit sign. He didn't give the creature time to react. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. The air warped around him, moving at twice the maximum speed of human capability. Sebastian launched himself off the wall, using a piece of fallen debris as a springboard. He soared through the dusty air, his heavy steel desk leg gripped tightly in both hands. The marionette turned its weeping faces toward him, letting out a deafening screech as it realized it had been tricked. It sent a dozen fleshy tendrils shooting toward him like spears. But Sebastian was already inside its guard. With his 500% enhanced strength, he brought the jagged steel spike down in a devastating, sweeping arc. The steel tore through the thick cluster of fleshy anchors connecting the monster to the ceiling. Thick, black ichor sprayed across the hallway as the cords snapped under the sheer kinetic force of the blow. Severed from its support, the massive, bloated creature plummeted. It hit the floor with a wet, sickening crunch, its multiple torsos rolling and thrashing in agony. The puppet corpses instantly collapsed, entirely lifeless once more as the connection was broken. Sebastian landed gracefully, his skeletal fortification absorbing the impact without a sound. He slowly walked up to the thrashing, weeping monster. "Don't, leave me alone!" The marionette gurgled, its countless eyes staring up at him in pure, pathetic terror. "You're not alone," Sebastian said coldly, raising the steel spike high above his head. "You're just dead." He drove the spike directly into the center of the monster's fused torsos, crushing its core. The creature let out a final, shuddering sigh before dissolving into a pool of putrid, bubbling black ooze. Target defeated. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained. The active skill, Nerve Stitch, allows the host to manifest bioelectric threads from their fingertips to briefly bind enemies or momentarily hijack their motor functions. Cooldown, 1 minute. A sharp, electric jolt sparked through Sebastian's fingertips. He raised his left hand, watching in grim fascination as thin, Glowing blue threads of bioelectricity danced between his knuckles. It was a tool of control. It was perfect. Clear, Sebastian called out, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the hallway. Jiawan slowly pushed the fire door open, his shotgun trembling in his hands. Minji limped behind him, her face completely pale as she surveyed the butchered corpses and the melting puddle of the marionette. Let's move. Juwon is waiting, Sebastian ordered, wiping the black ichor off his weapon. The descent through the remaining floors was agonizingly tense, but the building was completely silent. The sheer noise of the burrowers' destruction outside seemed to have frightened off the weaker mutants in the immediate vicinity. When they finally pushed open the heavy lobby doors and stepped out onto the ground floor, they were greeted by the sight of Zhang Juwon. The immortal man was sitting on the hood of a crushed sedan just outside the building's entrance. He was covered head to toe in grey ash and dried blood, but the massive wounds he had sustained during the building's collapse were entirely gone. He was casually smoking a cigarette, staring out into the burning, ruined streets of Seoul. Took you kids long enough, Juwon grunted, not looking back. Jiawan let out a massive sigh of relief, slumping against a cracked concrete pillar. You're alive, thank God. God packed up and left a few days ago, kid, Juwon replied, taking a long drag. He hopped off the car, turning to face Sebastian. The older man's eyes were sharp, evaluating the teenager who radiated an aura of dangerous, suppressed violence. You move like a ghost and hit like a tank. You're adapting to this new world entirely too fast. Survival requires rapid evolution, Sebastian replied flatly. You mentioned ports. Ferries. Juwon nodded slowly, his expression grim. Before the military comms went entirely dead, there was a broadcast. Evacuation ships at the eastern ports. Busan, Donghae. They were trying to establish a quarantine zone on the islands, maybe push across the sea toward Japan or Taiwan. Do you think they survived? Minji asked, a desperate sliver of hope in her voice. Juwon crushed his cigarette under his heavy boot. Listen to me clearly. There is no promised land anymore. America, Europe, China, the infection is everywhere. It doesn't matter what flag flies over the soil, when human desire turns you into a monster, borders mean absolutely nothing. We aren't going to a port to find a glorious military rescue. We're going because a moving ship is harder to swarm than a stationary bunker. Sebastian nodded in agreement. Pragmatism over hope. Seoul is a death trap. Millions of people means millions of monsters. We need a vehicle to break out of the city limits. The roads are completely jammed with abandoned cars, Jiawan pointed out, gesturing to the chaotic tangle of metal on the street. Then we find something heavy enough to push through them, Sebastian said, his eyes scanning the gloom. Suddenly, the air temperature plummeted. Sebastian's breath plumed in the air in a white cloud of frost. A thick, unnatural fog began to roll in from the ruined alleyway where the light shop used to stand. It wasn't smoke from the fires, it was a dense, chilling mist that seemed to swallow the ambient light, plunging the street into absolute darkness. What is that? Minji whispered, her teeth chattering. Juwon's hands balled into massive fists. The worlds are bleeding. That shop, it was holding a boundary shut. Now that it's destroyed, the things that live in the shadows don't have to wait for us to die anymore. Through the dense, unnatural fog, Sebastian's echolocation picked up something impossible. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and entirely human. But as the figure stepped out of the mist, the blue system screen flashed with a violently red, unprecedented warning. Critical alert, anomaly detected. Entity type, half-monster hybrid, desire. Perfect equilibrium, warning, this entity possesses human intelligence and monster physiology. Threat level, unquantifiable. The figure was a young man, wearing a torn, bloodied school uniform much like Jiawan's. His eyes were entirely black, devoid of whites or irises, and his left arm was completely enveloped in a swirling, razor-sharp mass of hardened, metallic blood. He didn't roar. He didn't charge blindly. The boy simply tilted his head, his pitch-black eyes locking onto Sebastian with terrifying, calculating intelligence. "You smell different from the rest," the hybrid whispered, his voice echoing perfectly through the dense fog. "You smell like the system." Chapter 12, The Black Eyes and the Bleeding Truth. The freezing fog clung to the ruined asphalt, turning the street into a graveyard of shadows. Sebastian stood frozen, his heavily reinforced muscles coiled and ready to snap. The young man standing before them, a high schooler, just like Sebastian and Jiawan, radiated an aura that was completely, terrifyingly alien. The blue system screen in Sebastian's peripheral vision didn't offer a weak point or a core ability. It only flashed with that unprecedented, violent red warning: threat level, unquantifiable. System. Sebastian echoed, his grip tightening on his blood-stained steel spike. "I don't know what you're talking about." The hybrid tilted his head, his pitch-black eyes devoid of any human warmth, yet burning with sharp, calculating intellect. The swirling, metallic mass of hardened blood that formed his left arm shifted, the edges sharpening into a jagged, 3-foot blade. "You're lying," the hybrid whispered, his voice impossibly calm amidst the apocalypse. "The monsters here, they are completely consumed by their desires. But you eat them. I can hear it in your blood. You are something entirely new." Zhang Juwan stepped in front of Jiawan and Minji, his massive frame shielding them. The immortal man spit out his cigarette, his eyes locking onto the hybrid's blade. "Whatever he is, he's dangerous. Don't let him get close, kid." "I only want to see," the boy said softly. "If you are a man, or a monster." The hybrid didn't sprint. He simply vanished. "Warning, lethal strike incoming." Sebastian's echolocation screamed. The displacement of air was the only warning he got before the hybrid materialized directly in front of him, the metallic blood blade swinging in a devastating horizontal arc aimed right at his neck. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. Moving at 200% maximum human speed. Sebastian threw his upper body backward, but the hybrid's strike was blindingly fast. The very tip of the blood blade grazed Sebastian's collarbone, slicing cleanly through his thick uniform jacket and biting into his skin. A sharp gasp escaped Sebastian's lips. Even with his 200% increased bone density and fortified skeleton, the blade cut through his flesh like wet paper. Juwan roared, lunging forward with a massive, earth-shattering right hook aimed at the hybrid's head. The boy didn't even look at him. He simply raised his normal, human right hand and caught Juwan's massive fist in his palm. The sheer kinetic impact shattered the concrete beneath the hybrid's feet, but the boy didn't budge an inch. With a flick of his wrist, the hybrid twisted Juwan's arm and drove the hilt of his blood blade violently into the immortal man's sternum, sending Juwan crashing backward into the side of the ruined sedan. "Don't interfere," the hybrid said coldly. Jiawan raised his shotgun, his hands trembling violently, but Sebastian barked, "Hold your fire. You'll hit us." Sebastian didn't retreat. He couldn't outrun this thing, so he had to outmaneuver it. The hybrid lunged again, bringing the blood blade down in a crushing vertical strike. Sebastian raised his thick steel desk leg, catching the blow. The sound of metal clashing against hardened blood rang out like a gunshot. Sebastian's 500% enhanced strength strained under the sheer, impossible weight of the hybrid's attack. His boots dug into the asphalt, cracking the street beneath him. "He's holding back," Sebastian realized with a chill. "He's just testing me. Let's see how you handle this," Sebastian snarled. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. Sebastian released his left hand from the steel pipe and thrust his palm toward the hybrid's chest. Brilliant, crackling blue threads of bioelectricity shot from his fingertips, wrapping tightly around the hybrid's torso and blade arm. The boy's black eyes widened slightly in surprise as the high-voltage bioelectric current surged through his nervous system. For a single, precious second, the hybrid's muscles locked, paralyzing him completely. Sebastian didn't waste the opening. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. Instead of striking the boy, Sebastian drove his heavy steel boot directly into the ground beneath the hybrid's feet. The concentrated shockwave erupted through the asphalt. The ground violently shattered, throwing the paralyzed hybrid off balance and sending him crashing backward into the fog. Sebastian stood his ground, panting slightly, blue sparks still dancing across his knuckles. The hybrid landed gracefully a dozen yards away, the bioelectric threads dissipating into the mist. He looked at his own arm, then up at Sebastian. Slowly, the massive, jagged blade of hardened blood began to retract, melting back into normal flesh and a torn school uniform sleeve. "You didn't try to kill me," the boy noted, his black eyes unblinking. "You only disabled me to create distance. If I wanted to kill you, I would have aimed the shockwave at your skull," Sebastian lied smoothly, hiding the fact that a direct hit probably wouldn't have been enough to put the anomaly down permanently. Ju-1 groaned, pulling himself up from the dented car, his chest rapidly knitting itself back together. "Are we done dancing?" the immortal grumbled, wiping blood from his chin. The hybrid nodded slowly. "You are in control. You aren't like the others." "Who are you?" Ju-1 asked, his voice shaking as he lowered the shotgun. "My name is Cha Hyun-soo," the boy replied, his voice tinged with a deep, crushing sorrow. "And you need to leave this city immediately. The boundary that shop was holding is gone. The things coming through the mist now aren't just born from human desires. They are older. And they are infinitely hungrier." Sebastian stepped forward. "We're trying to reach the eastern ports. But we need heavy transport. This city is a gridlock." Hyun-soo pointed down the fog-choked street. 3 blocks north, near the old financial district. A military convoy was ambushed there yesterday. Most of the vehicles are burned, but there is an armored riot control truck near the back of the line. The keys should still be inside. Take it. "Why are you helping us?" Sebastian asked, his eyes narrowing. "You're half monster. You could just as easily eat us." "Because humanity is losing," Hyun-soo said softly. "The supposedly impenetrable alpine bunkers of Switzerland and the sprawling, heavily armed underground complexes in America fell hours ago. Concrete and steel couldn't stop a plague that blooms inside the mind. The world is dying. The least I can do is help the few who can still fight back." Without another word, the hybrid turned and walked back into the freezing fog, vanishing like a ghost into the apocalyptic night. A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the distant, echoing roars of monsters tearing through the city. 3 blocks north, Sebastian said, breaking the tension. He looked at Ju-1. "Can you drive an armored truck?" "I can drive anything with an engine," Ju-1 grunted, cracking his knuckles. "Let's move before whatever that kid warned us about finds us." They moved quickly and quietly through the fog, using Sebastian's echolocation to navigate around the twisted wrecks of cars and the roaming packs of minor mutants. The devastation was absolute. The silence of the dead city was more oppressive than the screams. They reached the financial district within 20 minutes. Just as Hyun-soo had promised, a shattered military convoy lay scattered across a massive intersection. Humvees were flipped over, and armored personnel carriers were torn open like tin cans, the result of a massive brute or behemoth attack. But sitting near the rear of the wreckage, miraculously untouched, was a massive, heavily armored black riot control truck. It had reinforced steel grating over the windows and a heavy plow welded to the front bumper. "Perfect," Ji-won muttered, jogging toward the driver's side door. Sebastian turned back to check on the others. Ji-won was keeping watch with his shotgun, his eyes darting nervously through the fog. But Minji had stopped a few feet away, her head bowed, her shoulders trembling violently. "Minji," Sebastian said, his voice flat. "Get in the truck." She didn't move. A soft, wet dripping sound hit the asphalt. Drib. Drib. Sebastian's enhanced hearing picked it up instantly. He stepped closer, his grip tightening instinctively on his steel weapon. "Minji. Look at me." Slowly, the girl raised her head. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the physical horrors of the ruined world. Thick, dark blood was pouring from both of her nostrils, running down her chin and dripping steadily onto her torn school uniform. "Sebastian," she whispered, her voice fracturing. I hear a voice. It's asking me, if I want to walk without pain." Ji-won froze, his blood running completely cold. Ji-won stopped with his hand on the truck's door handle, turning around with a look of pure dread. The monsterization process had begun. Chapter 13, The Price of Empathy and the Centipede. The heavy, suffocating silence of the financial district was broken only by the steady, wet patter of blood hitting the asphalt. Ji-won dropped his shotgun to his side, his face completely devoid of color. He took a trembling step toward the girl he had known since middle school. "Minji? Just breathe. Fight it. Don't listen to the voice." "Ji-won, step back," Sebastian ordered, his voice as cold and hard as the steel pipe in his hand. He didn't move to help her. His muscles coiled, preparing for the inevitable violence. "We can't just leave her," Ji-won cried, tears welling in his eyes. He reached out, his hand inches from her trembling shoulder. "She's just scared. Minji, please." "Ji-won." Ji-won bellowed from the truck, his deep voice cracking like a whip. "Get away from her now." Minji slowly raised her head. Her eyes, usually so timid and full of guilt, were completely dilated, the whites rapidly filling with a sickening, oily blackness. The blood pouring from her nose had coated her chin and throat in a thick, dark layer. "It hurts," she whispered, her voice distorting, dropping an octave into a guttural, wet rattle. "My ankle, my fear. I just want to run away. I want to run without it hurting anymore. I need more legs, so I never have to stop." Crunch. The sound came from inside her body. It was the sickening noise of her spine violently snapping and elongating. Ji-won screamed and scrambled backward, tripping over a piece of debris and falling hard onto the street. Minji didn't fall. She leaned backward at an impossible, 90-degree angle, her spine stretching like taffy. Her torn school uniform ripped open as four new, multi-jointed limbs violently erupted from her ribcage, covered in a hard, chitinous shell. Her injured leg twisted entirely backward, reforming into a jagged, spear-like appendage. Within seconds, the weeping high school girl was gone. In her place stood a grotesque, centipede-like monstrosity standing on six segmented, razor-sharp legs. Her human face was suspended at the front of the carapace, her jaw unhinged and her black eyes completely empty. Alert, hostile mutant detected. Monster type, the crawler, desire. Painless flight and relentless escape, the crawler let out a deafening, clicking screech. It didn't look at Sebastian or Ji-won. Its twisted, singular focus locked onto Ji-won, who was scrambling desperately across the ground, trying to reach his dropped shotgun. "Run," the monster gargled in Minji's distorted voice. We have to run. The creature scuttled forward with terrifying, skittering speed. Its sharp limbs pierced the asphalt like needles, crossing the distance to the terrified boy in the blink of an eye. It raised its front two scythe-like legs, preparing to impale Jiawan and drag him away. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. The air warped. Sebastian was a blur of motion, covering the 10 yards between him and the monster in a fraction of a second. He didn't aim for the creature's armored carapace. He aimed for its momentum. Using his 500% enhanced strength, Sebastian swung his steel desk leg like a massive golf club, smashing it directly into the crawler's front right leg just as it descended toward Jiawan's chest. The chitinous limb shattered upon impact, exploding into a spray of black ichor and bone fragments. The monster shrieked, its balance completely thrown off. It tumbled sideways, its massive, elongated body rolling across the asphalt and crashing violently into the side of a rusted sedan. Sebastian stood over Jiawan, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with predatory intent. "Pick up your gun," he snarled at the boy without looking down. "If you can't pull the trigger, close your eyes. But do not get in my way." The crawler quickly righted itself, its 5 remaining legs skittering frantically. The human face at the front of the carapace twisted into a mask of pure fury. "Pain," it shrieked. "You brought the pain back." The creature didn't charge directly this time. It scrambled up the side of the overturned sedan and launched itself onto the glass facade of the adjacent bank building. To Sebastian's horror, the monster's sharp legs dug effortlessly into the concrete and glass, allowing it to scuttle across the vertical wall with horrifying speed. It began to circle them from above, a blur of clicking limbs and clicking jaws. "It's too fast," Jiawan warned, stepping up beside Sebastian, his massive fists raised. "It's waiting for an opening." "Then I'll make one," Sebastian muttered. He tracked the monster's movements along the wall, calculating its trajectory. He needed it on the ground. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. Sebastian raised his left hand, aiming at the creature as it scuttled past a shattered second-story window. Brilliant blue threads of bioelectricity shot from his fingertips, arcing through the foggy air like a localized lightning strike. The threads connected with the monster's elongated abdomen. The crawler convulsed wildly as the high-voltage current hijacked its nervous system. Its remaining legs instantly locked up, unable to grip the wall. With a screech of panic, the heavy, armored body plummeted from the second story, crashing down onto the street in a tangle of twitching limbs. Sebastian didn't hesitate. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. He triggered his kinetic dash, closing the distance before the monster could even recover from the electrical shock. He leaped into the air, bringing his heavy steel boot down with the force of a localized meteor directly onto the center of the creature's carapace. Boom! The localized shockwave shattered the monster's armored shell. The sheer kinetic force of the impact drove the crawler straight into the asphalt, cratering the street beneath them. The creature thrashed in absolute agony, its human face looking up at Sebastian with a sudden, horrifying flicker of clarity. For a fraction of a second, the blackness in the monster's eyes receded, revealing the terrified, weeping eyes of the class president. "Sebastian!" The monster whimpered, tears mixing with black blood. "It hurts so much." Jiawan sobbed from the pavement, unable to watch. Jiawan turned his head away, a grim expression on his tired face. Sebastian stared down at the broken, weeping creature. The bullied orphan he used to be might have hesitated. He might have tried to find a cure, or apologize. But the new Sebastian knew the truth of this world. There was no cure. There was only the end. "I know," Sebastian said softly, his voice devoid of malice, but utterly devoid of mercy. He raised the jagged steel spike high above his head and drove it straight down through the human face, pinning the creature's head to the shattered asphalt. The monster twitched once, its elongated body shuddering violently before finally going completely still. Target defeated. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained the passive skill, pain nullification. The host's nervous system is permanently altered. Physical pain receptors are dampened by 90%, allowing the host to fight through catastrophic injuries without suffering shock. A sudden, chilling numbness washed over Sebastian's entire body. The lingering, dull ache in his back from the invisible mutant's claws completely vanished. The burning strain in his tendons from overusing his kinetic dash evaporated. He didn't feel invincible, he just felt utterly disconnected from his own suffering. He could be torn to pieces, and his brain simply wouldn't register the agony. It was a terrifying, beautiful upgrade. Sebastian pulled his weapon free, wiping the black blood off on the monster's torn uniform. He turned around, his face a completely unreadable mask. Jiawan was on his knees, dry heaving into the fog. Jiawan simply looked at Sebastian, his dark eyes analyzing the complete lack of remorse in the teenager's posture. She was turning, Sebastian stated, his voice flat. If I didn't do it, she would have killed Jiawan, and then she would have tried to kill us. That is the reality. Mourn if you have to, but do it in the truck. He walked past them, heading straight for the massive, black riot control vehicle. Jiawan sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He reached down and roughly hoisted Jiawan to his feet. He's right, kid. The world you knew died yesterday. You either adapt to the one that's left, or you end up like her. Let's go. They piled into the massive armored truck. The interior smelled of old leather and stale sweat, but the heavy steel plating offered a psychological comfort they hadn't felt in hours. Jiawan slid into the driver's seat, his massive hands easily wrapping around the heavy steering wheel. He found the keys sitting in the cup holder, just as the half-monster, Hyan-Su, had promised. The engine roared to life with a deafening, guttural rumble. All right, Jiawan growled, shifting the massive vehicle into gear. Next stop, the Eastern Highway. Hang on, kids. We're going to have to make our own road. Jiawan slammed his foot on the gas. The riot control truck surged forward like a heavily armored rhino. The massive steel plow welded to the front bumper slammed into the wreckage of the ruined military convoy, effortlessly tossing flip sedans and debris aside in a shower of sparks and grinding metal. Sebastian sat in the passenger seat, staring out the reinforced, grated window as they plowed through the burning streets of Seoul. The fog parted before them, revealing a city consumed by its own nightmares. They were leaving the capital behind, but the system interface hovering in the corner of his vision reminded him that the hunt was far from over. They were heading into the unknown. And Sebastian was ready to devour whatever got in their way. Chapter 14, The Highway of the Damned and the Echoes of the Dead. The heavy riot control truck was an unstoppable force of kinetic violence. Jiang Jiawan drove like a man who had nothing left to lose, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel as he piloted the 15-ton steel behemoth through the choked arteries of Seoul. The heavy steel plow welded to the front bumper roared as it collided with abandoned sedans and overturned delivery vans, effortlessly shoving them aside in a shower of brilliant orange sparks and shattering glass. Inside the reinforced cabin, the noise was deafening, a relentless metallic grinding that vibrated deep in their bones. Sebastian sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the apocalyptic landscape rolling past the grated windows. He looked down at his own hand. He reached into a tear in his uniform and pressed his thumb directly into the deep, jagged laceration the hybrid had left on his collarbone. Nothing. He felt the physical pressure, the wetness of his own blood, but the sharp, blinding sting of the wound was entirely absent. Passive skill, Pain nullification active. Sensory receptors dampened. It was an eerie, detached sensation, but it was exactly what he needed. In a world where a single mistake meant being torn to shreds, hesitation born from pain was a death sentence. In the back seat, Jayawan sat huddled in the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest. His shotgun lay across his lap, his knuckles white as he gripped the stock. He hadn't said a word since they left Minji's corpse pinned to the asphalt. The trauma of watching his friend twist into a monster had fractured something deep inside the teenager's mind. "We're approaching the Seoul tollgate," Ju-won announced, his gruff voice cutting through the mechanical roar of the truck. He downshifted, the engine protesting with a heavy growl. "It's the main artery leading to the eastern highways. If the military tried to hold a line, it would be there." Through the dissipating fog and falling ash, the massive concrete arches of the tollgate loomed in the distance. Ju-won's prediction was terrifyingly accurate, but the line hadn't held. The tollgate was a monument to absolute slaughter. Dozens of heavily armored military vehicles, tanks, APCs, and transport trucks were piled into a massive, burning barricade. The concrete pillars were scored with massive claw marks, and the asphalt was painted in broad, gruesome strokes of dried black and crimson blood. "They built a wall," Sebastian observed, his eyes narrowing. "And something climbed right over it," Ju-won finished, slamming his foot on the brake. The riot control truck screeched to a halt about 50 yards from the barricade. The plow was strong, but it couldn't push through a tangled mountain of 60-ton military tanks. The only way through was a narrow, jagged gap between a flipped personnel carrier and a shattered concrete toll booth. "It's too tight," Ju-won muttered, tapping the steering wheel. "I have to thread the needle. If we get wedged in there, we're sitting ducks." Sebastian unbuckled his seatbelt. The silence outside the truck was sudden, heavy, and completely unnatural. The ambient roars of the burning city had faded, replaced by a suffocating stillness. Passive skill, echolocation active. Sebastian closed his eyes. The micro-vibrations of the truck's idling engine sent sound waves rippling outward. Ping! 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 His eyes snapped open. The blood in his veins ran to ice. "Don't move," Sebastian ordered, his voice dangerously low. "What is it?" Jayawan whispered from the back, his voice trembling. "They're above us," Sebastian replied. "On the tollgate arches. Dozens of them." Before Ju-won could throw the truck into reverse, a sound echoed through the suffocating silence. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a monstrous screech. "Jayawan, please." It was a voice. A soft, weeping, terrified girl's voice. "It hurts so much, why did you leave me?" Jayawan's head snapped up. His eyes went wide, reflecting absolute horror and desperate, crushing guilt. "Minji! Don't listen to it, kid!" Ju-won barked, reaching back to grab Jayawan's shoulder. "She's dead. Sebastian killed her." "Jayawan, they're eating me!" The voice sobbed from the darkness outside, echoing perfectly off the concrete. "Barricades! No, no!" Jayawan scrambled backward, slapping Ju-won's hand away. He raised his shotgun, his eyes wild and unfocused. He reached for the handle of the truck's rear door. "I have to help her." "Jayawan, stop!" Sebastian roared, twisting in his seat. But the teenager was entirely consumed by his grief. He yanked the heavy door latch and shoved the steel door open, stepping out onto the ash-covered highway. The moment the door opened, the weeping voice instantly stopped. It was replaced by a chorus of overlapping, distorted, mocking laughter. From the shadows of the massive concrete tollgate arches, figures began to drop. They hit the roofs of the abandoned military vehicles with heavy, metallic thuds. They were hideous. Emaciated humanoids with skin pulled tight over jagged bones. But they had no eyes, no noses, and no ears. Their entire faces, their chests, and the palms of their elongated hands were covered in dozens of human mouths, all of them twitching, smiling, and whispering in stolen voices. Alert, pack threat mutants detected. Monster type, the mimics, desire, to be heard and believed, warning, immediate hostile swarm incoming. Get back in the truck! Sebastian yelled, kicking his passenger door open and diving out onto the asphalt. Jiawan stood paralyzed in the center of the road, surrounded by a dozen mimics crawling over the tanks like spiders. One of the creatures unhinged the primary mouth on its face and let out a localized, high-frequency scream. It wasn't just loud, it was a concussive wave of solid sound. The sonic blast hit Jiawan directly in the chest. The teenager was violently thrown backward, his shotgun flying from his hands as he crashed onto the pavement, clutching his bleeding ears in agony. The pack of mimics shrieked in unison, their legs coiling to launch themselves at the helpless boy. Ju-1, lay on the horn. Drown them out! Sebastian ordered, breaking into a sprint. The immortal man slammed his fist into the center of the steering wheel. The massive, blaring air horn of the riot control truck erupted into the night, shattering the mimics' coordinated sonic attacks. The monsters flinched, their dozens of mouths snapping shut in pain. It was the only opening Sebastian needed. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. The air warped around him. Moving at 200% maximum human speed, Sebastian became a blur of lethal kinetic energy. He bypassed Jiawan entirely, launching himself off the hood of a rusted sedan and flying directly into the center of the swarm. He didn't use the steel spike. He needed area control. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. As he landed on the roof of an abandoned military Humvee, right in the middle of 5 crouching mimics, Sebastian channeled his 500% enhanced strength into his boot and stomped downward. Boom! The localized shockwave violently caved in the roof of the armored vehicle, sending a devastating ripple of kinetic force outward. The 5 mimics were instantly blasted off their feet, their fragile, emaciated bones shattering mid-air as they were violently thrown into the surrounding concrete barricades. But there were still more. 2 mimics lunged at him from behind, their hands outstretched, the mouths on their palms opening to bite chunks of flesh from his back. Sebastian didn't even turn around. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. He threw his left hand backward, unleashing a chaotic burst of crackling blue bioelectric threads. The high-voltage web caught the 2 leaping monsters mid-air, instantly hijacking their nervous systems. They convulsed violently, their limbs locking up as they crashed helplessly onto the pavement. Sebastian drew his heavy steel spike, spinning on his heel. With ruthless, mechanized efficiency, he stepped forward and drove the jagged metal through the skulls of both paralyzed monsters, permanently silencing their stolen voices. Targets defeated. Extracting core abilities, success. Host has gained the active skill, Sonic Dissonance. Allows the host to emit a concentrated, high-frequency sound wave that violently disrupts the equilibrium and inner ear of targets within a 10-meter radius. Cooldown, 2 minutes. Sebastian pulled his weapon free, black blood hissing against the cold steel. The remaining mimics, seeing their pack decimated in a matter of seconds, scrambled backward up the concrete pillars of the tollgate, their mouths chattering in fearful, overlapping whispers. Sebastian didn't chase them. He turned and walked over to Jiawan, who was still curled on the ground, weeping and bleeding from his ears. Sebastian reached down, grabbing the teenager by the collar of his uniform, and hauled him effortlessly to his feet. He picked up the dropped shotgun and shoved it hard against Jiawan's chest. "Her voice is gone," Sebastian said coldly, looking deep into the boy's terrified eyes. And if you ever pull a stunt like that again, I will lock you out of this truck myself. Do you understand? Jiawan nodded frantically, a fresh wave of tears cutting through the ash on his face. He stumbled back to the riot control truck, pulling himself into the rear cabin. Sebastian climbed back into the passenger seat, slamming the heavy steel door shut. Jiawan looked at him, his face illuminated by the dim dashboard lights. You're a terrifying kid, you know that. Drive, Sebastian replied, wiping black blood off his cheek. Thread the needle. Jiawan grunted, shifting the heavy truck back into gear. The engine roared, and the massive vehicle crept forward, the steel plow grinding violently against the destroyed military tanks as Jiawan masterfully navigated the tight, jagged gap in the barricade. Metal shrieked against metal, but the heavy armor held. They burst through the other side of the tollgate, leaving the ruined city of Seoul behind them in a sea of ash and fire. The dark, empty expanse of the eastern highway stretched out before them. But as Sebastian looked out at the horizon, a cold dread finally pierced through his pain nullification. Miles away, illuminated by the flashes of distant lightning, the sky wasn't just filled with smoke. The clouds were swirling, descending toward the earth like massive, physical tendrils. The boundary between the world of the living and the abyss wasn't just bleeding anymore. It was tearing wide open. Chapter 15, The Warped Tunnel and the Fallen Titan. The Eastern Highway was a desolate ribbon of cracked asphalt stretching into the abyss. The riot control truck thundered through the night, its heavy tires chewing over abandoned luggage and shattered glass. Above them, the sky continued its horrifying transformation. Massive, swirling tendrils of dark clouds descended like the roots of some cosmic parasite, tearing at the fabric of the atmosphere. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Jiawan sat silently in the back, staring blankly at the floor panels, his shotgun resting limply in his lap. The boy had finally realized that the monsters weren't just monsters, they were his friends, his neighbors, his species. The psychological toll was heavier than any physical wound. Zhang Jiawan kept his massive hands firmly on the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. We're approaching the T-Bike mountain range, the immortal man grunted, shifting the heavy truck into a higher gear. To get to the eastern port of Donghae, we have to pass through the mountain tunnels. If they're caved in, we're stranded in the highlands. They won't be caved in, Sebastian replied, his eyes scanning the darkness. But they won't be empty, either. Passive skill, pain nullification active. Sebastian leaned against the reinforced window. He felt nothing of the exhaustion that should have been tearing his body apart. His mind was razor sharp, a hyper-focused predatory engine calculating their odds of survival. 10 miles later, the massive, gaping maw of the primary mountain tunnel loomed ahead. It looked like a black hole bored into the side of the earth. The highway leading into it was completely devoid of abandoned cars, an ominous sign that whatever lived inside had already cleared its front porch. Jiawan flipped on the truck's high beams. The brilliant white halogen lights pierced the gloom, illuminating the first 100 yards of the tunnel. Something is wrong, Sebastian muttered, narrowing his eyes. The light from the truck wasn't casting straight shadows. The beams seemed to bend and curve toward the ceiling, as if the very space inside the tunnel was warped. Passive skill, echolocation active. Sebastian closed his eyes, sending out a micropulse of sound. The feedback was immediate, and terrifying. The sound waves didn't bounce off the walls in a linear pattern. They spiraled wildly, caught in a massive, unseen vortex in the center of the tunnel. Stop the truck, Sebastian ordered. We can't stop, kid, we lose our momentum. I said stop. Jiawan slammed on the brakes. The massive riot control truck skidded to a halt, the heavy tires screaming against the asphalt just 50 feet inside the tunnel entrance. It was a good thing they did. A second later, A horrific groaning sound echoed through the cavernous space. The concrete ceiling directly ahead of them violently buckled downward. But the debris didn't fall to the floor. It floated. Massive chunks of concrete, rebar, and abandoned cars were suspended in mid-air, slowly revolving around a terrifying epicenter. Floating in the center of the debris field was a monstrous figure. It was humanoid, but easily 10 feet tall. Its body was encased in a sleek, shifting armor of compressed, high-density bone and muscle. But it was the uniform clinging to the monster's torso that made Ju-Won's blood run cold. It was the shredded remains of black tactical gear, bearing the insignia of the NIS Superhuman Division. No. Ju-Won breathed, his eyes widening in absolute horror. That's Agent Beck. He had telekinetic and gravitational manipulation. The infection took him. Alert, Apex threat mutated superhuman detected. Monster type, the Atlas, desire, to carry the weight of the world/absolute control, warning, gravitational anomaly detected. Kinetic energy heavily suppressed in a 50-meter radius. The weight. A booming, distorted voice echoed from the floating mutant, causing the very air pressure in the truck's cabin to spike. Everything is so heavy. I have to hold it. I have to control it all. Suddenly, the front end of the 15-ton riot control truck groaned violently. The front tires slowly lifted off the asphalt. Hold on! Ju-Won roared, grabbing the steering wheel as the massive vehicle was pulled into the monster's localized gravity well. Ji-Won screamed as he was pinned against the ceiling of the rear cabin, his shotgun floating uselessly beside him. The intense gravitational pressure began to crush the reinforced glass of the truck's windows. Spiderweb cracks exploded across the windshield. If he crushes the truck, we die inside a steel coffin, Sebastian stated coldly, popping the latch on his door. Are you insane? Ju-Won yelled, struggling against the intense G-force pinning him to his seat. You step out. There, the gravity will crush you into a red smear. I have denser bones than you, Sebastian replied. He kicked the door open. The moment Sebastian stepped out of the truck cabin, the crushing weight of a collapsing star slammed into his shoulders. His knees buckled, and the concrete floor cracked under his boots. Passive skill, skeletal fortification active. His hypercalcified skeleton screamed under the immense pressure, but it held. He forced himself to stand straight, his muscles bulging as he fought against the warped gravity. The Atlas mutant slowly turned its heavily armored head toward Sebastian. Its eyes were twin spheres of swirling, violent purple energy. You carry no weight, the monster boomed, raising one of its massive, armored hands. Let me give it to you. The floating debris cars, boulders of concrete, jagged rebar suddenly shot toward Sebastian like missiles fired from a railgun. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. Sebastian tried to dash forward, but the gravity well acted like thick mud. His 200% speed was drastically reduced. He barely managed to dive sideways as a rusted sedan smashed into the wall where he had just been standing, completely obliterating the concrete. I can't outrun his projectiles in this field, Sebastian calculated rapidly, rolling back to his feet as another massive chunk of debris hurled toward him. I have to break his concentration. Hey, ugly! Sebastian roared, planting his feet firmly into the cracking asphalt. Active skill, sonic dissonance engaged. Sebastian opened his mouth and unleashed a concentrated, high-frequency sound wave directly at the floating monstrosity. The invisible cone of sheer sonic violence tore through the air. It was a frequency designed to utterly shatter the inner ear and disrupt equilibrium. The Atlas monster shrieked, clutching its armored head with both hands. The violet energy in its eyes flickered violently. The moment the monster lost its focus, the gravity well collapsed. The 15-ton riot control truck slammed back onto the asphalt with a Deafening crash, blowing out its front tires. The floating debris rained down from the ceiling like a meteor shower. Jiawan fell from the cabin ceiling, crashing hard against the floorboards. Sebastian didn't waste the opening. With the gravity well down, his physical limits were fully unleashed. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. Instead of striking the monster, Sebastian drove his heavy steel boot into the ground beneath him, channeling every ounce of his 500% enhanced strength into the blow. The localized shockwave shattered the highway beneath him, propelling him upward like a human rocket. He soared through the falling debris, closing the 30-foot gap between him and the staggering mutant in a heartbeat. He gripped his blood-stained steel desk leg with both hands, drawing it back. The Atlas monster recovered, its purple eyes locking onto the airborne teenager. It raised a hand, attempting to instantly crush Sebastian with a localized gravity spike. But Sebastian was faster. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. While still mid-air, Sebastian threw his left hand forward. Crackling blue bioelectric threads shot from his fingertips, instantly connecting with the monster's heavily armored face. The high-voltage current surged directly into the mutant's brain pan. For a single, fatal microsecond, the Atlas's nervous system rebooted. The gravity spike fizzled out into nothing. Sebastian's momentum carried him directly into the monster's chest. With a primal roar, he drove the jagged steel spike completely through the thick bone plating of the mutant's sternum, burying it to the hilt directly into the creature's heart. The momentum of Sebastian's strike carried them both backward. They crashed violently into the tunnel ceiling, then plummeted back down, slamming into the asphalt with earth-shattering force. Sebastian stood up slowly, pulling his steel weapon from the dead mutant's chest. The purple glow in the monster's eyes faded into dull grey ash. Target defeated. Bonus, superhuman trait detected. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained. The active skill, gravitational anchor, allows the host to drastically manipulate their own personal gravity field for 10 seconds. Can make the body completely immovable or light enough to glide. Cooldown, 3 minutes. Sebastian exhaled a long, slow breath. He felt a strange, shifting sensation deep within his cells, an absolute mastery over his own physical mass. He looked back at the riot control truck. The front tires were blown, and the windshield was completely shattered, but the engine was still idling with a heavy, stubborn purr. Ju-1 kicked the driver's side door open and stepped out, rubbing his neck. The immortal man looked at the dead, heavily armored NIS agent on the ground, a look of profound sorrow crossing his rugged features for a brief moment before hardening into stone. He was the strongest agent in our sector, Ju-1 rumbled, looking up at Sebastian, who stood atop the corpse completely unharmed. And you just gutted him like a fish in under a minute. He relied too much on his ability and forgot his blind spots, Sebastian said clinically, wiping the black blood from his steel spike. Let's change those tires. We need to keep moving. It took them 20 minutes to jack up the heavy truck and swap the blown front tires with the spares bolted to the rear. The silence in the tunnel was oppressive, heavy with the realization that even the strongest defenders of humanity were not immune to the mind-warping infection. Ju-1 climbed back into the driver's seat. Jiawan remained silently in the back, clutching his shotgun like a safety blanket. Sebastian took the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The riot control truck rolled forward, leaving the fallen titan behind in the shadows. When they finally broke through the exit of the mountain tunnel an hour later, the coastal city of Donghae lay before them, nestled against the sea. But Ju-1 immediately slammed on the brakes. Sebastian stared through the shattered windshield, his pain nullification failing to stop the sudden, icy dread that gripped his chest. The city of Donghae was completely silent, shrouded in the same thick, unnatural fog that had consumed the light shop. But that wasn't the nightmare. The Eastern Sea, the massive body of water separating Korea from Japan, was no longer moving. It was entirely black, completely still, and towering over the coastline in an impossible, vertical wall of solid, obsidian liquid. The world's. Ju-won whispered, his massive hands trembling on the steering wheel. They've finished bleeding. The abyss is fully here. Chapter 16, The Obsidian Sea and the Leviathan's Wake. The riot control truck sat idling on the cracked coastal highway, its shattered windshield framing an impossible nightmare. The Eastern Sea, a massive expanse of water that should have been rolling with midnight waves, had ceased to be an ocean. It was a towering, vertical wall of solid, obsidian blackness stretching endlessly to the north and south. It reached hundreds of feet into the ash-choked sky, completely defying the fundamental laws of gravity and physics. There was no reflection, no tide, and no sound. It was an absolute void that swallowed the dim light of the burning world. This isn't possible, Jae-won stammered from the back seat, his grip tightening painfully on his shotgun. Water can't do that. It's not water anymore, kid, Jang Ju-won murmured, his rugged face pale beneath a layer of grime. The immortal man turned off the truck's engine, the sudden silence inside the cabin feeling heavier than the vehicle itself. The boundary between our world and the abyss didn't just break. It flipped inside out. Sebastian didn't speak. He pushed his heavy steel door open and stepped out onto the ash-covered asphalt of the cliffside road overlooking the port city of Donghae. The air here was freezing, carrying a scent that had nothing to do with the ocean. It smelled like ancient dust, ozone, and cold iron. Passive skill, echolocation active. Sebastian closed his eyes, projecting a localized sound wave down toward the sprawling dockyards below. The feedback he received made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The port was heavily fortified. He could map out the shapes of massive concrete barricades, abandoned military transport helicopters, and several large evacuation ferries moored at the docks. But the most terrifying detail was what he didn't hear. There were no heartbeats. Donghae had been the designated evacuation point for hundreds of thousands of refugees and soldiers. Yet, the entire city was a sprawling, silent graveyard. There were no roars of brutes, no scurrying of crawlers, and no weeping of mimics. The monsters born from human desire had completely vanished from the coastline. The port is completely empty, Sebastian said, opening his eyes and looking down at the docks. No survivors. No mutants. Ju-won stepped out of the truck, lighting a crushed cigarette with trembling hands. If 1 million people were down there, and there are no bodies, where did they go? Sebastian pointed a finger toward the towering, vertical wall of black liquid looming just beyond the docks. Into the wall. A heavy, suffocating dread settled over the trio. If they wanted to escape the Korean peninsula, their only path was forward. Directly into the anomaly that had swallowed an entire city's worth of people. We need one of those ferries, Sebastian stated, his voice completely devoid of fear. His pain nullification wasn't just physical, it had numbed the paralyzing grip of existential terror. He was a predator. Evaluating an environment, nothing more. If the sea is solid, we can't sail on it. But we can use a ship's reinforced hull as a shelter to wait out whatever the hell this is. They left the heavily damaged truck on the cliffside and made their way down a winding, debris-filled access road toward the docks. Jae-won walked in the center, his shotgun raised, his eyes darting frantically at every shadow. The closer they got to the vertical sea, the stranger the physical world behaved. The ash falling from the sky didn't land on the ground, it drifted sideways, pulled toward the obsidian wall by a terrifying, horizontal gravity. They reached the primary boarding terminal. The ground was littered with dropped luggage, discarded military rifles, and abandoned teddy bears. It was a snapshot of pure, unadulterated panic, frozen in time. "Check the ferries," Ju-won ordered, his voice hushed. He drew a heavy combat knife he had salvaged from the mountain tunnel. "Stay close." They moved toward a massive, white civilian ferry tied to the main concrete pier. The boarding ramp was lowered. As Sebastian placed his boot on the metal ramp, his echolocation picked up a sudden, microscopic vibration. It didn't come from the ship. It came from the shadows pooling beneath the dock. Slither, drip. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the sound of wet, heavy leather dragging across concrete. Back to back. Sebastian barked, instantly drawing his blood-stained steel spike. Ji-won spun around, raising his combat knife. Ji-won leveled his shotgun, his hands shaking but his stance surprisingly firm. The shadows beneath the concrete pier began to boil. It was as if the darkness itself was gaining physical mass. Slowly, an entity pulled itself up over the edge of the dock. It bore no resemblance to the mutants born of human desire. It had no face, no twisted human anatomy, and no frantic, obsessive energy. It was a creature born directly from the abyss. It stood 8 feet tall, its body composed entirely of shifting, jagged obsidian glass and writhing, shadowy tendrils. Where a head should have been, there was only a gaping, vertical fissure radiating a blinding, freezing violet light. Critical alert, abyssal entity detected. Entity type, Void Stalker, origin, the other side, warning, this entity absorbs kinetic and thermal energy. Conventional physical attacks will be severely dampened. Shoot it! Ji-won roared. Ji-won squeezed the trigger. The shotgun blasted a massive spray of lead perfectly into the center of the creature's chest. But there was no spray of blood, no stagger. The lead pellets hit the swirling, shadowy mass of the entity's torso and simply stopped, suspended in the darkness before dissolving completely into dust. The Void Stalker didn't roar. It simply raised a hand composed of razor-sharp glass and pointed at Ji-won. A localized, horizontal vortex of gravity erupted from its fingertips. Ji-won shrieked as he was violently pulled forward, his boots skidding across the concrete pier. He was being dragged directly into the creature's gaping, violet fissure. "Grab him!" Ji-won yelled, lunging forward and wrapping his massive arms around Ji-won's waist. But the immortal man's boots began to slide, too. The gravitational pull of the void entity was absolute, dragging both of them toward total annihilation. Sebastian didn't panic. The system had warned him that kinetic attacks were useless. He needed to use the physics of the abyss against it. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Sebastian triggered the skill he had ripped from the fallen NIS agent. He didn't make himself lighter, he made himself impossibly, unfathomably heavy. His physical mass spiked, locking him perfectly into the concrete pier. He was a boulder immovable by any force. He reached out, his 500% enhanced strength rippling, and grabbed Ji-won by the collar of his suit. With a brutal yank, Sebastian ripped both Ji-won and Ji-won out of the creature's gravitational vortex, hurling them backward onto the deck of the ferry. The Void Stalker's featureless face snapped toward Sebastian. The violet light in its fissure flared with sudden, cold anger. It vanished. There was no displacement of air, no sound. It simply ceased to be in one place and instantly appeared directly in front of Sebastian, its jagged, glass-like claws descending to slice him into ribbons. Sebastian couldn't dodge. His gravitational anchor made him immovable, but it also made him incredibly slow. Active skill, sonic dissonance engaged. Sebastian opened his mouth and unleashed a devastating, high-frequency shockwave at point-blank range. The invisible cone of sonic violence slammed into the Void Stalker. Because the entity was composed of crystalline glass and shadow, the high-frequency vibration had a catastrophic effect. The jagged, obsidian armor covering its body instantly spider-webbed with thousands of glowing cracks. The creature let out a static-filled, electronic shriek, stumbling backward as its physical form began to vibrate apart. Jiawan, the legs! Sebastian roared, dropping his gravitational anchor to regain his speed. Jiawan, lying on his back on the ferry deck, pumped his shotgun. He didn't hesitate this time. He aimed low and fired. The buckshot tore through the creature's already fractured, crystalline knees. The glass shattered completely, dropping the towering entity onto the concrete. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. Sebastian exploded forward, a blur of pure lethality. He didn't swing his steel spike, he knew the creature absorbed kinetic blows. Instead, he channeled his power into his free hand. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. As he closed the distance, Sebastian plunged his left hand directly into the blinding violet fissure that served as the monster's face. The freezing cold of the void instantly bit into his flesh, threatening to consume his arm. But Sebastian unleashed a massive, chaotic surge of bioelectric threads directly into the entity's core. The conflicting energies, the biological electricity of the system and the absolute zero of the abyss reacted violently. The void stalker convulsed, its violet light turning a blinding, unstable white. With a sound like a shattering mirror, the entity exploded from the inside out, disintegrating into a shower of harmless black ash that drifted up toward the vertical sea. Sebastian pulled his hand back, panting heavily. His sleeve was completely gone, and the skin on his arm was severely frostbitten, but the pain nullification kept his mind entirely clear. Target defeated. Extracting core. Ability, success. Host has gained. The passive skill, Void Step, allows the host to completely bypass physical friction and wind resistance, rendering their movements entirely silent and vastly reducing stamina consumption. Sebastian flexed his frostbitten fingers. He took a step backward. There was no sound of his heavy boot hitting the concrete. He moved again, realizing that he felt no resistance from the air around him. He was a perfect silent phantom. Is it dead? Jiawan gasped, lowering the smoking shotgun. It's gone, Sebastian confirmed, his voice barely a whisper in the silent dockyard. Jiawan stood up, rolling his shoulders as his minor scrapes healed. He looked at the pile of black ash, then out at the towering vertical ocean. That thing, it wasn't a mutant. It was a guard dog. Suddenly, the ground beneath the entire city of Donghae began to vibrate. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a deep, rhythmic thrumming that originated directly from the towering, obsidian wall of water. Thump! 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 The vertical sea began to shift. The smooth, glass-like surface of the black water rippled, forming massive, concentric circles that stretched for miles across the horizon. Sebastian walked to the edge of the pier, staring up at the impossible wall. His echolocation was entirely overwhelmed by the sheer, unfathomable scale of the vibration. High above them, near the top of the vertical ocean, the black water parted. A colossal, glowing yellow eye, easily the size of a city block, opened within the depths of the obsidian sea. The pupil, a vertical slit of burning cosmic fire, slowly swiveled downward, locking its gaze directly onto the tiny, ruined port of Donghae. The abyss wasn't just bleeding into their world. It was looking right at them. Chapter 17, The Horizontal Fall and the Ghost Ship. The colossal yellow eye hanging in the vertical, obsidian sea didn't just look at them. It weighed upon them. The moment the vertical pupil locked onto the port of Donghae, a wave of crushing, unseen pressure washed over the docks. It wasn't gravity, it was pure, concentrated cosmic malice. The ash falling from the sky instantly stopped in mid-air, suspended by the sheer, terrifying presence of the Leviathan. Jiawan collapsed to his knees, clapping his hands over his ears as a thin stream of blood dripped from his nose. I can't, my head is going to explode. He screamed, though the sound barely carried through the sudden, oppressive vacuum in the air. Get up! Zhang Juwan roared, grabbing the boy by his uniform collar and hauling him to his feet. Even the immortal man's rugged face was pale, his heavily muscled legs trembling under the psychic weight. Sebastian stood perfectly still near the edge of the pier. His pain nullification blocked the agonizing migraine threatening to split his skull, leaving his mind cold and calculating. Critical alert, Class Omega entity, the Leviathan, actively altering local physics. Warning, horizontal gravitational shift imminent. Evacuate open areas. Before the blue system text could fade, the physics of the port completely shattered. With a sound like a tearing vault door, the world tilted not physically, but gravitationally. The downward pull of the Earth vanished, instantly replaced by a massive, horizontal suction originating directly from the vertical sea. 100 yards away, an abandoned cargo container groaned, lifted off the asphalt, and flew entirely sideways, plunging into the black water with a silent splash. Then, the abandoned cars began to slide. To the ferry. Now! Sebastian commanded, his voice slicing through the chaos. They sprinted for the massive boarding ramp of the civilian ferry. Juwan carried Jiawan under one arm, his heavy boots slamming against the concrete. Sebastian didn't run. He engaged his newly acquired void step. The moment he triggered the skill, all physical friction and wind resistance vanished. He didn't just sprint, he glided. His boots barely touched the ground, his movements utterly silent and terrifyingly fast. He shot up the metal boarding ramp like a phantom, easily outpacing the localized gravity storm. He reached the main deck just as the massive, braided steel mooring lines holding the ferry to the pier began to snap under the immense horizontal pull. Crack! Crack! The steel cables whipped through the air like lethal snakes, shattering the concrete dock. Juwan threw Jiawan over the threshold of the ferry's heavy blast doors, diving in right behind him just as the final mooring line gave way. Hold on to something! Juwan bellowed, digging his fingers into the bolted steel railing of the corridor. The massive civilian ferry lurched violently. Stripped of its earthly anchors, the thousands of tons of white steel were yanked directly toward the vertical, obsidian ocean. Through the reinforced glass of the ferry's promenade doors, Sebastian watched the port of Donghae shrink away. They were falling sideways. The ferry sailed horizontally through the air, pulled inexorably into the massive, unblinking yellow eye of the Leviathan. Sebastian, the anchor! Juwan yelled over the deafening groan of the ship's bending hull. It won't work! Sebastian yelled back, gripping a structural pillar. My gravitational anchor locks. My mass to the surface I'm touching. If I lock onto the ship, I fall with the ship. There was nothing they could do. They were insects caught in a cosmic current. The ferry slammed into the vertical wall of black water. There was no sound of crashing waves. There was no rush of water flooding the decks. The moment the nose of the ferry pierced the obsidian surface, all light, sound, and sensation were instantly extinguished. It was a sensory void so absolute that Sebastian couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. His echolocation returned absolutely zero feedback, swallowed by the infinite black. The violent shaking of the ship ceased, replaced by a smooth, chilling glide. For what felt like an eternity, they were suspended in nothingness. Then, reality slammed back into them with the force of a train wreck. Gravity aggressively reasserted itself, but it was wrong. The ferry dropped out of the void, crashing heavily onto a solid surface. The impact threw Sebastian across the slanted promenade deck, his fortified skeleton absorbing the brutal collision with a dull thud. Emergency red lighting flickered to life in the ferry's corridors, bathing the tilted, claustrophobic space in a bloody glow. Sebastian slowly picked himself up. The ship was pitched at a sharp 30-degree angle. He looked around. Ju-won was pulling himself up from the floor, rubbing his neck, while Jae-won was violently vomiting into a corner, his shotgun clattering against the metal grate. "Is everyone in one piece?" Ju-won grunted, popping a dislocated shoulder back into place with a sickening crunch. "I'm alive," Jae-won choked out, wiping his mouth. Sebastian didn't answer. He walked to the shattered glass of the promenade doors and looked outside. They were no longer in Korea. They were no longer anywhere on Earth. The ferry had crashed onto a massive, rusted flight deck of an ancient military aircraft carrier. But the carrier wasn't in an ocean. It was floating in an endless, swirling expanse of dark violet clouds and jagged, floating islands of urban debris, skyscrapers ripped from the earth, chunks of highways, and massive, calcified bone structures. Above them, the sky was a deep, bruised crimson, devoid of any sun or stars. "The other side," Sebastian whispered. The system had mentioned a boundary. They had just crossed it. The Leviathan hadn't eaten them, it had simply discarded them into its own dimension. "Alert, host has entered the abyssal plane. Warning, local physics may be unstable. Monster presence, maximum." "Where the hell are we?" Ju-won asked, stepping up beside Sebastian and staring out at the nightmare landscape. "Inside the bleeding," Sebastian replied coldly. He turned away from the window, pulling his heavy steel pipe from his belt. "We're stranded on this carrier. The ferry is our only shelter, but we need to secure it. If the Leviathan pulled us in, it pulled other things in too." Passive skill, echolocation active. Sebastian closed his eyes, sending a microvibration pulsing through the tilted steel hull of the ferry. The sound waves traveled down the corridors, through the passenger cabins, and into the massive lower cargo hold. His eyes snapped open. "We aren't alone on this ship," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Monsters?" Jae-won asked, scrambling to pick up his shotgun, his hands shaking violently. "I don't know," Sebastian narrowed his eyes. "The heartbeat is steady. It's not erratic like a mutant's. But it's heavily armored. And it's moving up from the cargo hold." "We clear the ship," Ju-won stated, gripping his heavy combat knife. "We take the high ground. If it's a threat, we kill it before it corners us." "Stay behind me," Sebastian told them. He triggered his void step. The red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows as Sebastian began to move down the slanted corridor. His boots made absolutely zero sound against the metal grating. He glided like a wraith, completely detached from friction, his movements terrifyingly smooth. They descended the main stairwell, moving deeper into the bowels of the tilted ferry. The air grew colder, smelling heavily of rust and stagnant seawater. As they reached the entrance to the lower vehicle deck, the heavy steel doors had been violently torn completely off their hinges, the thick metal peeled back like a tin can. "Whatever did this has strength that rivals yours, kid," Ju-won noted, tracing the massive tear in the steel. Beyond the ruined doors, the massive cargo hold was plunged in near total darkness, illuminated only by the occasional sparking wire hanging from the ceiling. Dozens of abandoned civilian cars were chained to the deck, sitting in absolute silence. Clang, scrape. The sound echoed from the far side of the massive hold. It sounded like heavy steel dragging against the floor. Sebastian held up a fist. Ju-won and Jae-won froze. Through the gloom, a silhouette emerged from behind a row of parked cars. It was human in shape, but completely clad in what looked like crude, jagged medieval armor entirely forged from rusted car parts, reinforced steel, and barbed wire. The figure was dragging a massive, 8-foot-long executioner's sword forged from a helicopter rotor blade. But it wasn't the armor or the weapon that made Sebastian's echolocation spike. It was the face beneath the welded steel helmet. It was a young man, his eyes glowing with an intense, burning golden light. Critical alert, anomaly detected. Entity type, half-monster hybrid, desire. Unbreakable protection, another hybrid, Sebastian muttered. The armored figure stopped, raising the massive rotor blade sword with one hand as if it weighed nothing. The golden light in his eyes locked onto Sebastian, burning with fierce, protective intelligence. "You smell like human blood," the armored knight's voice echoed hollowly from beneath the helmet. "But you walk like a monster." Sebastian stepped forward, his shadow veil ready to trigger, blue bioelectricity already sparking between his knuckles. "I could say the exact same thing about you." The knight leveled his massive blade. "Leave this ship, or be cut down." Chapter 18, The Scrap Metal Knight and the Hull Breach. The tilted cargo hold of the ferry was completely silent, save for the hum of blue bioelectricity arcing between Sebastian's knuckles and the heavy, rasping breaths echoing from beneath the knight's welded helmet. "Leave this ship," the armored hybrid repeated, the golden light in his eyes burning brighter in the gloom. "Or be cut down." Sebastian didn't retreat a single inch. His mind, completely detached from the paralyzing grip of fear thanks to his pain. Nullification, analyzed the threat with cold precision. The knight's armor was crude but incredibly thick, forged from reinforced car chassis and barbed wire. The executioner's sword, a sheared-off helicopter rotor blade, probably weighed over 200 pounds, yet the hybrid held it with one hand. Alert, entity's core desire is unbreakable protection. Warning, defensive capabilities are extremely high. High kinetic resistance detected. "I don't take orders," Sebastian said softly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And I don't walk away from a shelter. We are staying. If you want us gone, you'll have to physically move us." "Wait, Sebastian," Zhang Juwan rumbled, stepping forward and holding up a massive, calloused hand. The immortal man looked at the armored figure. "He's not fully turned. Look at his eyes. He has the same control as the kid in the fog." "I don't care if he's the saint of the apocalypse," Sebastian replied, his grip tightening on his blood-stained steel spike. "He's blocking the path." The knight didn't wait for them to negotiate. He took a heavy step forward. Clang! His metal-plated boot struck the deck. Despite the heavy armor, he moved with terrifying, explosive speed. The hybrid swung the massive rotor blade sword in a devastating horizontal arc, aiming to cut Sebastian and Juwan cleanly in half. "Get down!" Juwan roared, shoving Jiawan behind a chained-down sedan. Sebastian didn't duck. Active skill, void step engaged. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. Freed from all wind resistance and physical friction, Sebastian didn't just run, he vanished. He slid perfectly under the massive arc of the rotor blade. The sheer wind pressure from the knight's swing shattered the windows of the parked cars around them, but Sebastian was already inside the hybrid's guard. With his 500% enhanced strength, Sebastian thrust his jagged steel spike directly upward, aiming for the narrow gap beneath the knight's welded helmet. But the hybrid's reflexes were monstrous. He released his right hand from the sword hilt and caught Sebastian's steel spike in his bare, armored palm. Sparks showered the dark cargo hold as metal ground violently against metal. Sebastian gritted his teeth, pouring every ounce of his hypercalcified kinetic power into the thrust, but the hybrid didn't budge. He was a living fortress. "You are fast," the knight's voice reverberated from the helmet. "But you lack weight." The hybrid violently twisted his grip, attempting to wrench the weapon from Sebastian's hands. At the same time, he brought his heavy metal knee up, aiming to crush Sebastian's ribcage. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. In a fraction of a second, Sebastian manipulated His personal gravity field. His mass spiked exponentially. He became as heavy as a bank vault. The knight's knee slammed into Sebastian's ribs, but instead of launching the teenager backward, the impact merely resulted in a deafening metallic crack. Sebastian's fortified skeleton absorbed the blow, and his anchored mass held him perfectly in place. The golden eyes beneath the helmet widened in shock. "My turn," Sebastian whispered. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. Sebastian released his left hand from the spike and slammed his palm squarely against the knight's scrap metal chest plate. A blinding surge of chaotic blue bioelectricity erupted from his fingertips. He expected the hybrid to paralyze, to lock up as the high-voltage current hijacked his nervous system. But the knight had adapted. The crude, jagged metal armor acted as a perfect Faraday cage. The blue electricity arced harmlessly across the barbed wire and car chassis, grounding directly into the steel floor of the ferry without ever touching the hybrid's flesh. "Clever," the knight grunted, completely unfazed by the electrical assault. The knight had butted Sebastian with his heavy steel helmet. The impact was like getting hit by a cannonball. Even with his pain nullification and skeletal fortification, the sheer kinetic force disoriented Sebastian, sending him sliding backward across the slanted deck. Before Sebastian could recover, the hybrid raised his massive rotor blade sword high above his head, ready to bring it down and cleave Sebastian in two. Boom! The deafening roar of a shotgun shattered the air. Jiawan had popped up from behind the chained sedan, his hands shaking but his aim true. The buckshot slammed directly into the side of the knight's helmet. The heavy armor dented, and the kinetic force staggered the massive hybrid, throwing his devastating downward strike off target. The rotor blade smashed into the steel deck mere inches from Sebastian's leg, tearing a massive, jagged gash right through the floor of the ferry. Jiwan didn't miss the opening. The immortal man charged like a raging bull, tackling the armored knight around the waist. The sheer momentum carried both of them backward, crashing violently into a stacked pile of metal shipping crates. "Hold him down!" Sebastian yelled, recovering instantly. He engaged his void step, gliding silently across the deck, his steel spike raised for a lethal strike to the hybrid's exposed joints. "Stop!" the knight roared, struggling against Jiwan's massive, regenerating grip. "If you kill me, they have no one." Sebastian froze, the tip of his jagged spike hovering an inch from the hybrid's throat. The golden light in the knight's eyes wasn't burning with a desire to kill. It was burning with absolute, desperate terror. "Who?" Sebastian demanded, his voice cold. The hybrid nodded toward the back of the cargo. "Hold." Behind the wall of shipping crates, hidden in the deepest, darkest corner of the slanted ferry deck, was a massive, reinforced steel storage container. The heavy doors were bolted shut from the outside. "The survivors," the knight breathed heavily, the golden light in his eyes flickering. "I locked them inside when the sky tore open. I couldn't stop the monsterization. My desire to protect them was too strong. But I kept my mind. I built this armor to keep the madness out. To keep them safe." Jiwan slowly released his grip, stepping back but keeping his fists raised. "You're a guardian." The knight slowly pulled himself up, using the massive rotor blade as a crutch. "My name is Tae-hoon. There are 20 people in that container. Children. The elderly. If you are here to slaughter, you'll have to cut me to pieces first." Sebastian lowered his weapon slightly, calculating the variables. Fighting an entrenched, heavily armored hybrid who had nothing to lose was a massive drain on his stamina. And if there were humans on board, they could be useful. "We aren't here to kill humans," Sebastian stated flatly. "We were dragged into the abyss by the Leviathan, just like this ship." Before Tae-hoon could respond, the entire ferry shuddered violently. It wasn't a minor tremor. The massive, thousands of tons civilian ship, groaned as it was physically lifted several feet into the air, tilting the cargo deck to a terrifying 45-degree angle. The chained-down cars shrieked as their suspension snapped, sliding wildly down the slanted floor and crashing into the walls. "What's happening?" Jiawan screamed, clinging desperately to a metal pillar to keep from sliding down into the dark abyss of the lower deck. "Something is outside!" Jiawan roared, fighting the gravity. The horrific sound of tearing metal echoed through the hold. The thick, reinforced steel hull of the ferry on the starboard side began to buckle inward, glowing cherry red from intense, localized heat. Screech! The hull was violently ripped open. A massive, jagged hole the size of a bus was torn into the side of the ferry. The freezing, bruised crimson light of the abyssal plane flooded into the cargo hold, carrying the stench of ozone and rotting flesh. Through the massive breach, a colossal appendage forced its way into the ship. It was a massive, multi-jointed claw composed of jagged, calcified bone and pulsing, magma-like veins. Critical alert, abyssal scavenger detected. Entity type, the rust crawler. Origin, the other side. Warning, extremely high thermal and kinetic threat. A massive, insectoid head followed the claw into the cargo hold. It had no eyes, only a glowing, molten maw that dripped acidic saliva onto the metal deck, instantly melting through the steel. The rust crawler let out a deafening, clicking screech. Its sensory tendrils whipped through the air, instantly locking onto the scent of human blood coming from the reinforced storage container, where Taehoon had hidden the survivors. "No!" Taehoon roared. The knight didn't hesitate. Driven by his obsessive, monsterized desire to protect, Taehoon charged directly at the colossal abyssal entity. He swung his massive rotor blade sword with everything he had, slicing directly into the creature's thick, calcified leg. The blade bit deep, but the creature's acidic, magma-like blood sprayed outward, splashing across Taehoon's scrap metal armor and instantly melting the barbed wire and steel. The monster shrieked, swatting its massive claw forward. The backhand strike hit Taehoon with the force of a wrecking ball, sending the armored knight flying across the cargo hold and crashing into the heavy doors of the survivor's container. He slumped to the deck, his armor smoking and his helmet severely dented. The rust crawler turned its molten maw toward the container, preparing to melt the steel doors and consume everyone inside. "Sebastian!" Jiawan yelled, pulling his combat knife, though he knew it was utterly useless against a monster of this scale. Sebastian didn't retreat. A cold, predatory smile crept onto his face. This was an abyssal entity. The system would reward him heavily for this kill. "Hold its attention," Sebastian commanded, his eyes locking onto the creature's massive, multi-jointed legs. Active skill, sonic dissonance engaged. Active skill, void step engaged. The hunt in the abyss had officially begun. Chapter 19, Magma Blood and the Crushed Carapace. The high-frequency, localized shockwave of sonic dissonance erupted from Sebastian's lungs, tearing through the suffocating heat of the cargo hold. The invisible cone of sonic violence slammed directly into the rust crawler's massive, insectoid head. The creature didn't have ears, but its entire sensory network was composed of delicate, twitching tendrils designed to pick up micro-vibrations in the abyss. The concentrated sonic blast completely overloaded its nervous system. The colossal monster shrieked a sound like grinding tectonic plates and thrashed blindly. Its molten maw snapped shut, cutting off the stream of acidic, magma-like saliva that was eating through the steel deck. "Hey, ugly!" Zhang Jiawan bellowed, charging straight into the danger zone. The immortal man didn't have weapons that could pierce calcified bone, but he had something infinitely more valuable: endless durability. Jiawan grabbed a heavy, rusted engine block that had broken loose from a ruined sedan. With a primal roar, he hurled the massive chunk of metal directly at the creature's face. The engine block struck the rust crawler's jaw and instantly began to melt, but the sheer kinetic impact forced the monster to turn its attention away from the survivor's container. Furious, the creature whipped its massive, scythe-like front limb at Ju-1. Ju-1 crossed his thick arms over his chest to block. The jagged bone claw slammed into him with the force of a runaway train, shattering his forearms and slicing deep into his chest. The monster's acidic, glowing blood splashed across Ju-1's torso, instantly burning away his ruined suit and searing his flesh down to the ribs. Ju-1 was sent flying, crashing into a reinforced steel pillar, but the horrific, smoking wounds on his chest were already violently knitting themselves back together. "Now, kid!" Ju-1 roared through gritted teeth, steam rising from his rapidly healing flesh. Sebastian was already in motion. Active skill, void step engaged. Completely detached from friction and wind resistance, Sebastian moved like a phantom across the slanted, melting deck. The extreme heat radiating from the monster should have blistered his skin, but his pain nullification kept his mind absolutely sterile of panic. He didn't run along the floor. He glided up the slanted wall of the ferry, defying gravity through sheer momentum. He was a blur of lethal intent, closing the distance to the thrashing monster in a heartbeat. From the shadows, Ju-1 provided covering fire. The teenager pumped his shotgun and fired 3 rapid blasts. The buckshot couldn't pierce the monster's thick carapace, but it shredded the delicate, twitching sensory tendrils on the side of its head, blinding it on its right flank. Sebastian launched himself off the wall, soaring through the sweltering air directly over the creature's massive, multi-jointed back. He gripped his heavy steel spike with both hands, aiming for the glowing, magma-filled crevices between the creature's thick bone plates. With his 500% enhanced strength, he drove the spike downward. The steel pierced the thick, leathery membrane of the joint. But the moment the metal entered the monster's bloodstream, a violent hiss erupted. The acidic, superheated magma blood of the abyssal entity instantly superheated the steel. Within a second, the bottom half of Sebastian's weapon completely melted away, leaving him holding a useless, glowing red stump of metal. The rust crawler shrieked, bucking violently to throw the pest off its back. "My weapon is gone," Sebastian noted clinically, tossing the melted slag aside. He dug his heavily fortified, hypercalcified fingers directly into the thick ridges of the monster's bone armor to keep from being bucked off. "Guess I'll have to use my own mass." The monster reared up, its molten maw glowing fiercely as it prepared to spray a devastating wave of acid across the entire cargo hold. If it fired, Ju-1 and Tae-hoon would be melted to the bone. Sebastian crawled rapidly up the creature's back, reaching the base of its massive, insectoid skull. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. He slammed his left hand against the thick bone plating of the creature's neck. A chaotic, brilliant surge of blue bioelectricity erupted from his fingertips. The high-voltage threads desperately tried to hijack the creature's nervous system, but the monster was too massive. It didn't paralyze the beast, but it caused the creature's neck muscles to violently spasm, throwing its aim wildly off target. The wave of superheated, acidic magma missed Ju-1 and splashed against the ceiling of the cargo hold, instantly melting right through to the upper decks in a shower of sparks and molten steel. With the monster disoriented, Sebastian stood up on the back of the creature's neck, balancing perfectly despite the violent thrashing. He looked down at the glowing, unarmored crevice at the base of the skull. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Sebastian manipulated his personal gravity field. In a fraction of a second, his physical mass spiked exponentially. He went from weighing 160 pounds to weighing the equivalent of an armored tank. The sudden, catastrophic addition of localized gravity forced the colossal monster's head down, its chin violently smashing into the metal deck. But Sebastian wasn't done. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. While anchored to the creature's neck with unfathomable weight, Sebastian channeled his 500% enhanced strength into his right boot. He raised his foot and brought it down directly onto the vulnerable crevice at the base of the skull with the force of a localized meteor strike. Boom! The localized shock wave, combined with his anchored, crushing mass, resulted in absolute, catastrophic kinetic violence. The shockwave blasted straight downward, entirely bypassing the outer armor. The sheer force pulverized the creature's upper spinal column, violently separating its massive head from its body. The kinetic energy was so immense that it shattered the ferry deck beneath the monster, cratering the thick steel. The rust crawler's body convulsed wildly, magma blood erupting from the severed neck like a geyser. But the brain was dead. The colossal legs slowly folded, and the massive abyssal entity collapsed, utterly crushed under the weight of a single, highly evolved teenager. Sebastian deactivated his gravitational anchor, instantly returning to his normal mass. He leaped backward to avoid the geyser of acidic blood, landing gracefully on the slanted deck. His clothes were singed, and the skin on his arms was covered in severe, blistering burns, but his face remained a mask of cold, unreadable calm. Target defeated. Bonus: Abyssal entity slain. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained the passive skill, Thermal Carapace. The host's skin and cellular structure are permanently altered to absorb and disperse extreme heat and chemical corrosives. Grants near immunity to fire, acid, and boiling temperatures. A sudden, soothing coolness washed over Sebastian's entire body. He watched in grim fascination as the severe, blistering burns on his forearms rapidly peeled away, replaced by fresh, slightly darker skin that possessed a faint, almost imperceptible metallic sheen. The sweltering, suffocating heat of the cargo hold suddenly felt as comfortable as a cool spring breeze. He was losing his humanity piece by piece, trading it for pure survivability. It was a trade he would make 1,000 times over. "You killed it," a hollow, stunned voice echoed through the hold. Tae-hoon, the scrap metal knight, was slowly picking himself up from the floor. His crude armor was heavily scarred by the acidic blood, but the thick metal had done its job, protecting the hybrid beneath. The golden light in his eyes flickered as he stared at Sebastian, the boy who had just crushed an apex predator with his bare boot. Zhang Juwan walked over, wiping a smear of soot from his fully regenerated chest. The immortal man looked at the massive, headless corpse of the rust crawler, then at Sebastian. "You lost your weapon," Juwan grunted. It was just a pipe," Sebastian replied, rolling his newly fortified shoulders. "I'll find something better. Open the container. Let's see who we just risked our lives for." Tae-hoon didn't argue this time. The knight limped over to the massive, reinforced steel storage container. He reached out with his armored hands and ripped the heavy external deadbolts free, throwing the heavy steel doors open. The air inside the container was stale, reeking of fear and unwashed bodies. Huddled in the darkness were about 20 survivors. Most of them were civilians, terrified office workers, a few elderly people clinging to each other, and several weeping children wearing oversized life jackets. But as Sebastian's eyes adjusted to the gloom, his echolocation pinged off a figure sitting calmly in the very back of the container. It was a man in a pristine, tailored suit that looked completely untouched by the apocalypse. He wasn't cowering. He sat on a wooden crate, his legs casually crossed, reading a small, leather-bound book by the dim light of a crackling, floating orb of fire that hovered just above his shoulder. "Well, well," the suited man said, his voice smooth and incredibly cultured. He closed his book and stood up, the orb of fire floating obediently beside him. He stepped out of the shadows, revealing sharp, handsome features and eyes that glowed with a terrifying, piercing crimson light. Juwon instantly recognized him, his blood running cold. "Director Choi." "Hello, Juwon." It's been a long time since you deserted the agency, Choi smiled, adjusting his cuffs. He completely ignored the terrified civilians around him and locked his crimson eyes onto Sebastian. And who might this fascinating specimen be? You move with the kinetic efficiency of a machine, yet you reek of the abyss. Critical alert, Class S superhuman detected. Name, Choi Jin-won, former NIS Director of Anomalous Warfare, Threat Level, Extreme. Ability, Pyrokinesis and Thermal Manipulation. Sebastian stepped forward, unaffected by the heat radiating from the man's floating fireball. His newly acquired thermal carapace hummed beneath his skin. I'm the guy who just cleared the room, Sebastian said coldly. And this is my ship now. Choi let out a soft, amused chuckle. Is that so? How wonderfully ambitious. But I'm afraid we have a much larger problem on our hands than who claims this ruined ferry. Choi pointed a manicured finger toward the massive, jagged breach in the hull where the rust crawler had entered. Outside the ship, the bruised crimson sky of the abyssal plain was suddenly blotted out. A colossal, floating shadow passed over the ancient aircraft carrier they were stranded on. Sebastian walked to the edge of the hull breach and looked up. Floating through the violent purple clouds of the abyss was a city. It wasn't a ruin, it was a sprawling, Gothic metropolis of towering black spires, interconnected by massive bridges of pale bone, suspended entirely in the sky. And descending from the belly of this floating nightmare city were hundreds of thick, fleshy chains, dropping directly toward the aircraft carrier. The Leviathan didn't just throw us away, Choi said softly, stepping up beside Sebastian. It delivered us. And the harvest is about to begin. Chapter 20, The Harvesters and the Skyward Chains. The colossal fleshy chains plummeted from the floating Gothic metropolis, tearing through the violent purple clouds like the tentacles of a dying god. They didn't just hit the ancient aircraft carrier, they harpooned it. KRKR Cruum. The deafening impacts shook the entire abyssal plain. Massive links of calcified bone and pulsing sinew, each the size of a bus, smashed through the rusted flight deck of the carrier. The shockwave violently rocked the civilian ferry, throwing the terrified survivors inside the storage container to the floor. They're anchoring us. Jang Ju-won bellowed, struggling to keep his footing on the slanted deck. Director Choi Jin-won simply adjusted his pristine suit jacket, entirely unbothered by the apocalyptic tremors. The floating orb of fire hovering over his shoulder flared, expanding into a swirling vortex of intense, white-hot flames that illuminated the dim cargo hold. Not anchoring, Ju-won. Lifting. The city is hungry, and we are the main course. Sebastian didn't waste time looking at the sky. He had a more immediate problem, he was unarmed. He turned his back on the S-class pyromancer and walked calmly toward the decapitated, massive corpse of the rust crawler. The creature's superheated magma blood was still pooling on the floor, melting the steel deck. Thanks to his newly acquired thermal carapace, Sebastian didn't feel the blistering heat. He stepped directly into the puddle of acidic magma. The solace of his boots hissed and melted away, but his bare, metallic sheen skin absorbed the corrosive heat effortlessly. He gripped one of the monster's massive, jagged front scythes, a blade of pure, hypercalcified bone completely immune to extreme temperatures. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. Locking his mass to the floor, Sebastian channeled his 500% enhanced strength into his arms and violently wrenched the scythe backward. With a sickening crunch of cartilage and bone, he ripped the 8-foot, jagged abyssal blade entirely free from the monster's corpse. He swung the massive bone scythe with one hand. It hummed through the air, perfectly balanced, trailing faint wisps of smoke. He had his weapon. Incoming! Jae-won screamed, pointing his shotgun toward the massive breach in the ferry's hull. Sliding rapidly down the fleshy chains were the harvesters. They were grotesque, vaguely humanoid entities, standing 7 feet tall. Their bodies were wrapped tightly in straitjackets made of their own skin, and their faces were completely smooth and featureless, save for a single massive vertical zipper running from their forehead to their chin. They wielded long, hooked chains designed to drag prey into the dark. Alert, pack threat entities detected. Monster type, the skin binders, origin, the other side, warning, evasive maneuvering advised. 3 skin binders swung directly through the hull breach, landing gracefully on the slanted deck of the ferry. Taehoon, the scrap metal knight, roared, driven by his obsessive desire to protect the survivors cowering behind him. The hybrid charged forward, raising his heavy rotor blade sword. "Stay back, Tin Man," Choi murmured with a dismissive wave of his hand. The NIS director snapped his fingers. The vortex of fire above his shoulder instantly condensed into 3 hyper-compressed spears of white-hot plasma. They shot forward faster than a bullet, piercing the chests of the 3 skin binders. The extreme thermal energy instantly flash-fried the monsters from the inside out, turning them to ash before they even hit the ground. "Impressive," Sebastian noted coldly. "But you missed a few." Dozens more skin binders were pouring onto the deck of the aircraft carrier outside the ferry. They began crawling like spiders over the rusted exterior of the ship, searching for a way in. "Ju-1, guard the kids," Sebastian ordered, breaking into a sprint. "I'm taking the fight outside." Active skill, void step engaged. Frictionless and silent, Sebastian exploded through the hull breach, leaping out into the chaotic, crimson-lit expanse of the ancient aircraft carrier's flight deck. The scale of the nightmare was staggering. The massive runway was completely overgrown with jagged bone structures, and thousands of skin binders were descending from the floating city above. 2 harvesters immediately whipped their hooked chains at Sebastian's throat. Active skill, kinetic dash engaged. Moving at double human speed, Sebastian became a blur. He ducked beneath the whipping chains, spinning on his heel to build momentum. With a ruthless, mechanized efficiency, he swung the massive abyssal bone scythe. The jagged blade sheared effortlessly through the dense, straitjacket torsos of both monsters, bisecting them in a spray of black, viscous fluid. Targets defeated. He didn't stop. He was a reaper in the abyss. He triggered his nerve stitch, shooting bioelectric threads from his left hand to paralyze a group of 3 harvesters. Before diving into their ranks and shattering their skulls with localized seismic tremors channeled through his fortified boots. Suddenly, Sebastian's echolocation picked up an anomaly falling from the sky. It wasn't a monster. It was a chaotic, erratic heartbeat plunging directly toward the flight deck, frantically dodging the fleshy chains. Sebastian looked up. Plummeting through the air was a chubby teenage boy wearing a bright yellow raincoat. He was flailing wildly, desperately trying to control his descent. He wasn't falling, he was flying, but with absolutely zero finesse, bouncing off the massive chains like a pinball. Clinging tightly to the boy's back was a towering, heavily scarred man with dead, ruthless eyes. The man held a massive, blood-stained sledgehammer in one hand, completely unfazed by the terrifying drop. "Bong-sok, pull up! Pull up, you idiot!" the scarred man barked, his voice rough as sandpaper. "I'm trying, Mr. Sang-wook." "I'm too heavy," the floating boy, Kim Bong-sok, shrieked in pure terror. They were hurtling directly toward a massive swarm of skin binders gathering on the center of the flight deck. If they crashed there, they would be torn to shreds in seconds. Sebastian calculated their trajectory in a microsecond. Active skill, sonic dissonance engaged. Sebastian aimed his mouth directly at the swarm of harvesters and unleashed a high-frequency shockwave. The invisible cone of sound slammed into the monsters, disorienting them and sending them staggering backward, clearing a 30-foot radius on the rusted runway. "Drop!" Sebastian roared. Sang-wook didn't hesitate. The scarred fighter released his grip on the floating boy, plunging the last 40 feet like a stone. He hit the rusted deck feet first. The impact should have shattered his legs, but Sang-wook merely grunted, rolling forward and instantly rising to his feet, swinging his sledgehammer in a brutal, bone-crushing arc that obliterated a recovering skin binder's head. Anomaly detected, extreme human resilience. Name, Paiyan Sang-wook. Bongsok, suddenly freed of the extra weight, shot upward like a helium balloon. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," the boy yelled, frantically trying to weigh himself down by stuffing heavy chunks of debris into his raincoat pockets. He slowly floated down to the deck, hovering a few inches off the ground, hyperventilating. Sang-wook stood back to back with Sebastian, resting the heavy sledgehammer on his shoulder. He looked at the teenager holding the massive abyssal bone scythe, his dark, scarred eyes narrowing. "You hit hard for a kid," Sang-wook grunted, completely unbothered by the apocalyptic nightmare surrounding them. "Where'd you steal the bone?" "Ripped it off a bug," Sebastian replied, his gaze sweeping the encroaching horde of harvesters. "You're a long way from home." "Got sucked into a black puddle in the basement of my apartment building," Sang-wook spat, cracking his neck. "Found the flying kid crying on a floating piece of highway up there." He pointed his hammer toward the massive, Gothic city in the sky. "It's a slaughterhouse up there. And it's reeling us in." Sebastian felt the vibration in his fortified bones before he heard the sound. The massive fleshy chains connecting the aircraft carrier to the floating city went completely taut. With a deafening, metallic groan that resonated through the entire abyssal plain, the millions of tons of steel that made up the ancient aircraft carrier began to lift. The physics of the abyss defied all logic. The massive ship slowly broke free from the gravitational pull of the lower violet clouds and began to ascend directly toward the belly of the floating Gothic metropolis. "We're going up," Bongsok squeaked, clutching his yellow raincoat, floating nervously beside them. "Then we fight uphill," Sebastian stated, his pain nullification erasing any trace of despair. Suddenly, the vertical zippers on the faces of every single skin binder on the flight deck simultaneously zipped open. Underneath the smooth skin, there were no mouths, no eyes. There was only a blinding, pulsating crimson light that emitted a frequency so high it bypassed the eardrums and drilled directly into the brain. "Critical alert, psychic resonance detected. Warning, severe mental degradation imminent." Bongsok screamed, dropping to the deck end, clutching his head. Sang-wook staggered, dropping to one knee, blood trickling from his nose as he grit his teeth against the agonizing mental intrusion. Inside the ferry, Jiawan's agonized screams echoed into the night. But Sebastian stood perfectly still. The psychic attack battered against his consciousness, a searing wave of sheer agony meant to break the mind before the body. But physical or mental, pain was pain. Passive skill, pain nullification active. Overriding neural pathways. The crippling agony faded into a dull, distant hum. Sebastian slowly raised his bone scythe, his eyes devoid of anything resembling human empathy. "You want to get into my head?" Sebastian whispered to the glowing horde. "Let me show you what's inside."